The city of Jericho had walls so thick that houses were built inside them, and gates so massive it took dozens of men to open them. Ai was considered impregnable, perched on a mountain with strategic advantages that made it virtually unconquerable. More than small settlements, these were military fortresses that had withstood centuries of warfare. But here's what will blow your mind. Every single one of these seemingly invincible cities fell to a nomadic people who had been wandering in the desert for 40 years. Today, we're uncovering the complete story of how the mightiest civilizations of the ancient world met their end, and the archaeological evidence is absolutely staggering. But before we begin, if you're new to this channel, consider hitting that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. Tour support means we can continue creating more content to help you learn something new. Also, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is. We're building a community so you can connect with like-minded folks from around the world in the comment section down below. So, without further ado, let's get started, shall we? The city burns against the purple sky of evening. Ancient walls that have stood for generations crumble beneath the weight of time and war. The sound of ram's horns echoes through the valleys, a haunting melody that speaks of endings and beginnings. Somewhere in the distance, the cries of triumph mix with the whispers of the wind through empty streets. This is the story of cities that once thrived under the Mediterranean sun. Cities with names that now rest only in ancient texts and buried stones. Places where merchants counted gold, where priests offered incense to forgotten gods, where children played in courtyards that archaeologists would one day uncover with careful brushes and patient hands. Beyond the familiar tales of conquest lies a deeper mystery. What were these places before they became footnotes in history? Who walked their streets? Who defended their walls? Who called them home? The forgotten cities of Canaan carry secrets that span millennia, stories that reach back to the dawn of civilization itself. At first glance, this may seem like a simple tale of victory and defeat, but beneath the surface flows a current of human drama that touches every heart. These were not merely strategic targets on an ancient map. They were living communities where families gathered for evening meals, where lovers met beneath olive trees, where old men sat by gates sharing stories of their youth. The land that would become the stage for these epic encounters stretched from the great cedar forests of Lebanon to the shifting sands of the Sinai. A crossroads where three continents met, where empires rose and fell like waves upon the shore. The wealth of Egypt flowed through its trade routes. The wisdom of Mesopotamia found expression in its temples. The seafaring skills of the Mediterranean peoples brought exotic goods to its markets. More than just geography, this was a world where gods walked among mortals, where the forces of nature took human form, where every mountain and valley held sacred meaning. The people who built these cities understood their place in a cosmic order that stretched from the deepest underworld to the highest heavens. In the ruins of these ancient settlements, archaeologists have found evidence of sophisticated urban planning, street systems that channeled rainwater, defensive walls built with mathematical precision, palaces decorated with ivory and gold. But most moving of all, they have found the simple objects of daily life: clay cups from which children drank milk, toys carved from wood, jewelry worn by young brides on their wedding days. The story begins in shadow and ends in questions. Who were these people who called themselves Canaanites? What drove them to build cities in this contested land? Why did their names fade from memory while their stones remained buried beneath centuries of dust? The trumpets have fallen silent. The walls have crumbled. But the echo of their presence still resonates through the archaeological layers, waiting for patient scholars to piece together the fragments of their world. This is their story, told through the lens of those who came after, filtered through the voices of those who remembered them as both neighbors and enemies. As the sun sets over the modern landscape of Israel and Palestine, the shadows grow long across tells and ruins. Somewhere beneath the olive groves and wheat fields lie the foundations of cities that once challenged empires, that once stood as proud monuments to human ambition and divine favor. Their silence speaks volumes about the fragility of human achievement and the persistence of human memory. Introduction to Canaan Morning Light reveals a land that seems painted by divine hands. Rolling hills covered in olive groves stretch towards snow-capped mountains in the north. Coastal plains fertile with grain wave in the Mediterranean breeze. Rivers cut through limestone valleys, creating oases of green that have sustained life for thousands of years. This is Canaan, a name that carries the weight of prophecy and the promise of abundance. The land that flows with milk and honey, where shepherds find pasture for their flocks and farmers harvest grain from soil enriched by countless generations. At first glance, it may seem like a small corner of the ancient world, but its strategic position made it the crossroads of civilizations. The great empires of antiquity understood Canaan's importance. Egyptian pharaohs sent their armies northward to control its trade routes. Mesopotamian kings looked westward to its ports and fertile valleys. The Hittites of Anatolia extended their influence southward to secure access to its resources. Therefore, the people who chose to build their cities here knew they were claiming a prize that others would always covet. Beyond its natural beauty, Canaan possessed something more valuable than gold or silver. It controlled the land bridge between Africa and Asia, the narrow corridor through which goods, ideas, and armies had to pass. Merchants carrying spices from India, ivory from Africa, and cedar wood from Lebanon all traveled through its valleys. Each caravan that passed through brought taxes to local rulers and exposure to new ways of thinking. The earliest settlers recognized this potential. Archaeological evidence reveals that people have lived in this land for over 10,000 years. They built the world's first cities here, places like Jericho that were already ancient when the pyramids of Egypt were still dreams in Pharaoh's minds. These pioneers developed agriculture, domesticated animals, and created the foundations of urban civilization. More than just a geographical location, Canaan became a cultural melting pot. The Amorites brought their legal traditions from Mesopotamia. The Hivites contributed their knowledge of mountain warfare. The Jebusites perfected the art of fortress construction. Each group added its own ingredients to the mixture, creating a unique civilization that was neither purely Egyptian nor purely Mesopotamian, but something entirely new. The cities that emerged from this cultural blending were marvels of their time. Hazor grew to house 30,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in the ancient world. Gezer controlled the main highway between Egypt and Mesopotamia. Lachish became a fortress so strong that it took the Assyrian Empire 3 years to capture it. These were not crude settlements, but sophisticated urban centers with complex governments, skilled craftsmen, and international connections. The wealth that flowed through these cities supported a rich cultural life. Scribes developed new forms of writing. Artists created beautiful pottery and intricate jewelry. Musicians composed songs that echoed through palace halls and temple courtyards. The legacy of their creativity survives in museums around the world, testament to the sophistication of their civilization. Yet beneath this prosperity lay constant tension. The same geographic advantages that brought wealth also brought danger. No city could rest secure when empires rose and fell around them like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Therefore, the Canaanites became masters of diplomacy, skilled at playing larger powers against each other to maintain their independence. The gods they worshipped reflected this complex reality, deities of storm and fertility, of war and peace, of life and death. Their religious practices sought to maintain balance in a world where natural disasters could destroy crops and foreign armies could appear without warning. The temples they built served not just as places of worship, but as centers of economic and political power. As the Bronze Age drew to a close, this delicate balance began to shift. New peoples were moving across the ancient world, driven by climate change, political upheaval, and the search for new lands. The Sea peoples devastated the eastern Mediterranean. The Assyrians expanded their empire westward, and from the south, a group of desert wanderers began to eye the fertile lands of Canaan with increasing interest. The stage was set for one of history's most dramatic encounters. The settled, sophisticated cities of Canaan would soon face challengers who claimed divine mandate to possess their land. The collision between these two worlds would reshape the ancient Middle East and echo through the centuries in ways that continue to influence our world today. The gods of Canaan. In the highest places of the land, where cedar trees whisper secrets to the wind, the gods of Canaan made their homes. These were not distant deities dwelling in unreachable heavens, but present powers who walked among mortals, who felt the same passions, who fought the same battles between order and chaos that defined human existence. El stood at the head of this divine family, the gray-bearded father whose name meant simply God. Ancient beyond measure, he presided over the council of heaven with the wisdom of ages. His voice carried the authority of the eternal, yet his heart knew the tenderness of a father watching over his children. The high places of Canaan echoed with prayers to El, seeking his blessing on harvests, his protection in battle, his guidance in matters of justice. Beyond the patriarchal figure of El rose the vibrant presence of Baal, the storm god whose power commanded both fear and reverence. Young and mighty, Baal rode the clouds like a chariot, wielding lightning as his weapon and thunder as his voice. When the rains came to fill the cisterns and water the fields, the people knew that Baal had triumphed over the forces of drought and death. When storms raged across the Mediterranean, they saw his battles with the sea god Yam played out in wind and wave. The relationship between these gods reflected the complex nature of Canaanite society itself. El represented the stability of tradition, the wisdom of age, the importance of maintaining cosmic order. Baal embodied the dynamic forces of change, the necessity of struggle, the constant cycle of death and rebirth that governed both nature and human affairs. Together, they provided a framework for understanding a world where both permanence and change were essential. Asherah, the mother goddess, brought a different kind of power to this divine assembly. Her symbols, carved wooden poles that stood beside altars throughout the land, represented the life-giving force of the earth itself. She was the one who made the barley grow, who blessed women in childbirth, who ensured that the cycles of life continued generation after generation. Her worship sites, often located in groves of trees or beside springs of water, became centers of community life where people gathered to celebrate the turning of the seasons. The attraction of these deities lay not in their perfection, but in their humanity. They experienced jealousy, love, anger, and compassion, just as mortals did. Their stories, told and retold in temple courtyards and family gatherings, helped people make sense of their own struggles and triumphs. When a farmer watched his crops wither in drought, he understood it as part of Baal's eternal conflict with the forces of death. When a mother held her newborn child, she felt the blessing of Asherah's life-giving power. More than just objects of worship, these gods served as patrons of the cities that dotted the Canaanite landscape. Each urban center developed its own special relationship with particular deities, building temples that reflected local traditions and needs. The god of one city might be known for prowess in battle, while another might specialize in healing or fertility. This diversity created a rich tapestry of religious expression that allowed each community to maintain its unique identity while participating in the broader Canaanite cultural world. The rituals that honored these gods involved the entire community. Harvest festivals brought together families from miles around to share food, music, and stories. Sacred marriages performed by priests and priestesses symbolically ensured the fertility of the land for another year. Funeral rites that honored the ancestors maintained the connection between the living and the dead, ensuring that the wisdom of previous generations would continue to guide their descendants. The temples themselves became centers of learning and culture. Scribes attached to religious institutions preserved the old stories and composed new ones. Musicians developed complex liturgies that combined poetry, melody, and dance. Artisans created beautiful objects for use in religious ceremonies, developing techniques that would influence craftsmanship throughout the ancient world. These religious centers served as universities, banks, and cultural institutions all rolled into one. Yet the gods of Canaan also reflected the violent realities of their world. Baal's triumph over the sea god Yam was won through fierce battle. Anat, the goddess of war, was depicted with weapons in her hands and the heads of her enemies at her feet. The pantheon included deities whose primary function was to bring death to enemies and victory to their worshippers. This militaristic aspect of Canaanite religion would later become a source of conflict with peoples whose gods demanded different kinds of loyalty. The practice of child sacrifice, which archaeological evidence suggests was part of some Canaanite religious traditions, represents the darker side of this religious system. In times of extreme crisis, when cities faced siege or natural disasters threatened to destroy entire communities, some turned to the most extreme forms of religious expression. These practices, while not universal among the Canaanites, would later be cited by their enemies as evidence of their moral corruption. As new peoples entered the region, they encountered this complex religious landscape with a mixture of fascination and horror. Some, like the Philistines, adopted Canaanite gods into their own pantheon. Others, like the Israelites, saw them as dangerous rivals to their own religious traditions. The resulting conflicts would be fought not just with swords and spears, but with competing visions of how humans should relate to the divine. The gods of Canaan offered their worshippers a way of understanding a world where natural forces seemed both benevolent and hostile, where prosperity and disaster could alternate with frightening speed. Their stories provided comfort in times of trouble and frameworks for celebrating times of joy. But they also demanded loyalties that would clash with the emerging monotheistic traditions of the ancient world, setting the stage for conflicts that would reshape the religious landscape of the entire region. Egypt's shadow. The great river Nile flows northward through the desert, carrying the life-giving waters that have sustained Egyptian civilization for millennia. From its fertile delta, the pharaohs have long cast their gaze eastward toward the land bridge that connects Africa to Asia. Canaan, with its strategic position and valuable resources, has never been free from the influence of the mighty kingdom to the south. Egyptian control over Canaan was not merely political, but deeply personal. Pharaohs married their sons to Canaanite princesses, creating family bonds that ensured loyalty across generations. They sent their administrators to live in Canaanite cities, men who spoke the local languages and understood the customs of their subjects. These officials served as the pharaoh's eyes and ears, then reporting on everything from harvest yields to the movements of potential enemies. The wealth that flowed from this relationship enriched both lands. Egyptian gold and silver traveled north to purchase cedar wood from the Lebanese mountains, olive oil from the coastal plains, and wine from the hill country vineyards. Canaanite merchants became skilled at reading the hieroglyphic contracts that governed these transactions, while Egyptian scribes learned to write in the local cuneiform script that was used for international diplomacy. More than just trade goods, ideas moved along these ancient highways. Egyptian medical knowledge found its way into Canaanite healing practices. Canaanite agricultural techniques helped Egyptian farmers increase their yields. Religious concepts crossed cultural boundaries, creating new forms of worship that blended traditions from both civilizations. The goddess Astarte, originally Canaanite, became popular in Egyptian temples, while Egyptian concepts of divine kingship influenced Canaanite political thought. The military infrastructure that supported this relationship was impressive in its scope and sophistication. Egyptian garrisons, staffed by professional soldiers, stood guard at key strategic points throughout Canaan. These fortresses, built with the latest military engineering techniques, could withstand sieges that might last for months. They served not just as defensive positions, but as symbols of Egyptian power, visible reminders that the pharaoh's authority extended far beyond the borders of Egypt proper. The famous El Amarna letters, discovered by archaeologists in the ruins of the Egyptian capital, provide a fascinating glimpse into this world of international diplomacy. Canaanite kings wrote to their Egyptian overlords in the respectful language of vassals, reporting on local conditions and requesting military assistance when needed. These clay tablets, written in the diplomatic language of Akkadian, reveal a complex web of relationships that bound the entire region together. Yet Egyptian control was never absolute. The pharaohs understood that ruling distant territories required a delicate balance between authority and autonomy. Local kings were allowed to maintain their own courts, practice their own religions, and govern their own peoples according to traditional customs. This flexibility helped prevent the rebellions that might have erupted if Egyptian rule had been too heavy-handed. The Egyptian administrative system in Canaan was remarkably sophisticated. Tax collectors, trained in the scribal schools of Memphis and Thebes, kept detailed records of tribute payments. Military commanders, drawn from the ranks of the pharaoh's most trusted officers, maintained order while respecting local sensitivities. Diplomatic messengers, skilled in multiple languages, carried communications between the Egyptian court and its Canaanite vassals. The cultural impact of this relationship can still be seen in the archaeological record. Egyptian artistic styles influenced Canaanite craftsmen, who began incorporating hieroglyphic motifs into their pottery and jewelry. Egyptian architectural techniques appeared in Canaanite palace construction. Even religious practices showed Egyptian influence, as Canaanite priests adopted some of the rituals and ceremonies that had proven effective in maintaining divine favor in Egypt. But the Egyptian presence in Canaan was always vulnerable to broader changes in the political landscape. When the pharaohs were strong and Egypt was united, their control extended firmly into Canaan. When internal conflicts weakened the Egyptian state, or when new enemies appeared on other frontiers, the pharaohs were forced to reduce their commitments in Canaan. These fluctuations in Egyptian power created opportunities for other ambitious rulers to challenge the established order. The Hittite Empire, based in Anatolia, began to push southward into regions that Egypt considered its own sphere of influence. The rising power of Assyria threatened Egyptian interests in Mesopotamia. New groups of people, driven by climate change and political upheaval, began to migrate into regions that had been stable for centuries. These pressures forced Egypt to make difficult choices about where to commit its limited military resources. The famous Battle of Kadesh, where the Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses II fought the Hittite king Muwatalli II, demonstrated both the strength and the limitations of Egyptian power. While the pharaoh claimed victory, the battle actually ended in a stalemate that forced Egypt to negotiate a peace treaty with the Hittites. This agreement, one of the first recorded international peace treaties in history, acknowledged that there were limits to what even the mighty Egyptian empire could achieve. As the Late Bronze Age drew to a close, the signs of instability became increasingly apparent. Egyptian records speak of invasions by mysterious sea peoples who destroyed cities throughout the eastern Mediterranean. Climate change brought droughts that reduced agricultural yields and forced pastoral peoples to seek new grazing lands. Political upheavals in Mesopotamia sent waves of refugees westward into regions that were already feeling the strain of social change. The Egyptian garrisons in Canaan, once symbols of unshakable power, began to seem increasingly isolated and vulnerable. Local rulers, who had once competed for Egyptian favor, started to calculate whether their interests might be better served by other alliances. The stage was being set for a period of upheaval that would reshape the entire region and create opportunities for new peoples to claim their place in the land that had been dominated by Egypt for so long. The Israelite arrival. From the wilderness they come, a people shaped by 40 years of wandering in the desert, places where only the hardiest souls can survive. The sun has burned their skin to leather, the wind has carved lines of endurance into their faces, and the sparse vegetation of the wasteland has taught them to find sustenance where others would find only death. These are the children of Israel, and they carry with them a promise that will reshape the ancient world. Moses, the great lawgiver who led them out of bondage in Egypt, has died within sight of the promised land. His passing marks the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The mantle of leadership now falls to Joshua, a warrior who learned his craft in the battles against the Amalekites and the kings of the Transjordan. Where Moses was a prophet and a teacher, Joshua is a general and a conqueror, the man chosen to transform a wandering tribe into a settled nation. The Jordan River flows before them, swollen with spring rains and snowmelt from the mountains of Lebanon. Its muddy waters have formed a natural barrier between the wilderness and the promised land for countless generations. But for the Israelites, this river represents something more than a geographical obstacle. It is the threshold between their past as wanderers and their future as a people with a homeland to call their own. The crossing of the Jordan becomes a moment of transformation that echoes through the generations. As the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant step into the rushing waters, the flow stops, allowing the people to cross on dry ground. This miracle, reminiscent of the parting of the Red Sea that began their journey, serves as a sign that their God continues to fight for them, that the promises made to their ancestors are about to be fulfilled. Beyond the practical considerations of military strategy and political alliance, the Israelite arrival in Canaan represents a collision between two very different ways of understanding the world. The Canaanites, with their sophisticated cities and complex religious systems, have developed a culture that seeks to harmonize human needs with natural forces. The Israelites, forged in the crucible of desert wandering, bring with them a fierce monotheism that recognizes no compromise with other gods. The contrast between these two peoples could hardly be more stark. The Canaanites have spent centuries learning to live with the land, developing agricultural techniques that work with natural cycles, building cities that blend into the landscape, creating religious practices that honor the spirits of place. The Israelites have spent their formative years learning to survive without a homeland, developing a portable faith that can be practiced anywhere, creating social structures that do not depend on permanent settlement. Joshua's leadership style reflects this difference, where Canaanite kings rule through elaborate court ceremonies and diplomatic marriages. Joshua leads through direct action and personal example. Where Canaanite military commanders rely on advanced technology like iron weapons and horse-drawn chariots, Joshua depends on mobility, surprise, and the religious fervor of his troops. These different approaches to leadership will shape the coming conflicts in ways that neither side fully anticipates. The Israelite army that prepares to enter Canaan is unlike any military force the region has seen before. It is not a professional army fighting for pay or glory, but a people's militia motivated by religious conviction and the promise of land ownership. Every man who can bear arms is expected to serve, from the youngest who can hold a spear to the eldest who can still draw a bow. This creates a military force that may lack the sophisticated training of professional soldiers, but possesses a unity of purpose that professional armies often lack. The strategy that Joshua develops for the conquest of Canaan reflects both the strengths and weaknesses of his forces. Unable to match the Canaanites in conventional warfare, he chooses to rely on speed, surprise, and psychological warfare. Rather than laying siege to heavily fortified cities, he seeks to demoralize his enemies through dramatic victories that will spread fear throughout the region. Rather than fighting prolonged campaigns, he aims for quick strikes that will prevent his enemies from forming effective coalitions. The religious dimension of this strategy cannot be understated. The Israelites believe that they are fighting not just for territory, but for the honor of their God. This conviction gives them a fearlessness in battle that their enemies find difficult to understand or counter. When Israelite soldiers go into battle, they carry with them not just weapons, but the belief that they are participating in a cosmic struggle between good and evil, between the one true God and the false gods of the nations. The first glimpse of the Promised Land must have been overwhelming for people who had spent most of their lives in the desert. The Jordan Valley, green with spring growth, stretched out before them like a garden. The hills beyond, covered with olive groves and vineyards, spoke of a prosperity that their wandering lifestyle had never allowed them to experience. The sight of Canaanite cities, with their impressive walls and towers, must have been both inspiring and intimidating. Yet the Israelites also bring with them something that the Canaanites lack, a unified vision of their destiny. While the Canaanite cities remain divided by local loyalties and competing interests, the Israelites are united by their common experience of liberation from Egypt and their shared commitment to the covenant with their God. This unity will prove to be one of their greatest advantages in the struggles ahead. The stage is set for a confrontation that will determine the future of the entire region. The sophisticated, settled civilization of the Canaanites will face the fierce nomadic energy of the Israelites. The outcome will depend not just on military skill or technological advantage, but on the ability of each side to maintain its unity of purpose in the face of the challenges ahead. Jericho, the first to fall. The city of Jericho rises from the Jordan Valley like a ship anchored in a sea of green palms. Its walls, built and rebuilt over thousands of years, have witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations. Archaeological layers reveal the accumulated wisdom of human habitation stretching back to the dawn of agriculture itself. This is perhaps the oldest continuously inhabited city in the world, a place where human beings first learned to live together in large numbers, to build permanent structures, to create the complex social arrangements that we call civilization. The people of Jericho had every reason to feel secure behind their massive fortifications. The walls rose nearly 30 feet above the surrounding plain, built with stones that would challenge even modern construction equipment. Behind the outer wall stood an inner wall, creating a double barrier that had turned back invaders for generations. The city's location in the Jordan Valley provided natural protection, while its control of the trade routes between Egypt and Mesopotamia brought wealth that could purchase the finest weapons and hire the most skilled mercenaries. Inside the city, daily life continued with the rhythm of centuries. Merchants haggled in the marketplace over prices for goods that had traveled thousands of miles to reach this crossroads of civilizations. Children played in courtyards where their ancestors had played for generations. Women drew water from wells that had been dug when the world was young. The citizens of Jericho had survived the rise and fall of empires, and they had every reason to believe that their city would outlast any new threat that might appear on the horizon. The arrival of the Israelites created a sense of unease that rippled through the population. Refugees from other cities brought stories of unexpected defeats, of traditional military strategies that had failed against these desert warriors. The king of Jericho, whose name has been lost to history, faced a dilemma that would confront many rulers in the coming years. Should he trust in the strength of his fortifications, or should he seek accommodation with these newcomers who claimed to fight with divine support? The decision to resist would prove fateful. The Israelite army that appeared before Jericho's walls was unlike any military force the city had faced before. These were not professional soldiers seeking plunder or glory, but a people convinced that their God had promised them this land. Their strategy, dictated by divine command rather than military convention, seemed to make little sense by traditional standards. Instead of building siege engines or attempting to storm the walls, they simply marched around the city once each day for 6 days. The psychological impact of this strange siege cannot be overstated. The defenders of Jericho, trained in conventional warfare, found themselves facing an enemy who seemed to operate by entirely different rules. The daily procession of Israelite warriors, accompanied by priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant, created a sense of mounting tension that affected both the defenders and the civilian population. Each day brought the same inexplicable ritual, building towards some unknown climax that kept the entire city on edge. The presence of the Ark of the Covenant in the Israelite procession carried deep symbolic meaning. This sacred object, containing the stone tablets of the law that Moses had received on Mount Sinai, represented the presence of the Israelite God among his people. For the Israelites, it was a tangible reminder that they were fighting not just for territory, but for the fulfillment of divine promise. For the people of Jericho, watching from their walls, it must have seemed like a challenge to their own gods, a claim that some foreign deity was more powerful than the traditional protectors of their city. The story of Rahab, the woman who hid the Israelite spies, provides a human dimension to this epic confrontation. Her decision to betray her own city in favor of the invaders reflects the complex loyalties that warfare creates. Perhaps she was motivated by fear, recognizing that Jericho's position was hopeless. Perhaps she was moved by genuine religious conviction, seeing in the Israelite God a power greater than the traditional deities of Canaan. Whatever her motivations, her actions demonstrate that the conflict between Israelites and Canaanites was not simply a matter of ethnic or national identity, but involved deeper questions about the nature of divine power and human destiny. On the seventh day, the Israelite strategy reached its climax. 7 priests carrying ram's horns marched with the ark 7 times around the city walls. The number 7, sacred in Hebrew tradition, suggests that this was not merely a military operation but a religious ceremony, a ritual enactment of divine judgment. When the priests gave a long blast on their horns and the people shouted with a great cry, the walls of Jericho collapsed, allowing the Israelite army to enter the city. The destruction that followed was complete and terrible. The city that had stood for thousands of years was consumed by fire, its wealth dedicated to the Israelite God as a kind of religious offering. The archaeological record suggests that Jericho was indeed destroyed by fire during the Late Bronze Age, though scholars debate whether this destruction can be connected to the biblical account. What is certain is that the city's destruction marked the end of an era and the beginning of a new chapter in the history of the region. The fate of Jericho's population reflects the harsh realities of ancient warfare. Only Rahab and her family, protected by their agreement with the Israelite spies, survived the destruction. The rest of the inhabitants faced the terrible consequences of their decision to resist. This pattern of total destruction would be repeated at other cities throughout the conquest, creating a climate of fear that would influence the decisions of other Canaanite rulers. The fall of Jericho sent shockwaves throughout the region. Here was a city that had seemed impregnable, protected by walls that had stood for centuries, defeated by an enemy who seemed to rely more on religious fervor than military technology. The psychological impact of this victory was perhaps more important than its strategic value. It demonstrated that the Israelites were not just another group of nomadic raiders, but a force capable of challenging the established order throughout Canaan. For the Israelites themselves, the victory at Jericho became a foundational story that would shape their understanding of their relationship with God and their destiny as a people. It proved that their God was more powerful than the gods of the Canaanites, that their faith could overcome obstacles that seemed insurmountable by human standards. The story would be told and retold for generations, inspiring later generations of Israelites to trust in divine power rather than human strength. The ruins of Jericho, buried beneath centuries of accumulated dust and debris, stand as a silent testament to the fragility of human achievement. The city that had seemed eternal proved to be as temporary as the morning mist. Its fall marked the beginning of a new era in the history of Canaan, an era in which the established order would be challenged by peoples who carried with them very different ideas about the nature of God, society, and human destiny. Ai, the battle that almost failed. The name Ai means ruin in Hebrew, though when the Israelites first encountered this city, it was very much alive. Perched on a hill overlooking the Jordan Valley, Ai commanded one of the key routes into the central highlands of Canaan. Its position made it a natural fortress, but more importantly, it controlled access to the heartland of the Promised Land. After the stunning victory at Jericho, this smaller city seemed like it would fall easily to the Israelite advance. Confidence filled the Israelite camp as scouts returned with their assessment of Ai's defenses. The city was much smaller than Jericho, its walls less imposing, its garrison probably numbering only a few hundred men. The victory at Jericho had been so complete, so clearly the result of divine intervention, that many Israelites began to assume that all their battles would be won with similar ease. This assumption would prove to be a dangerous mistake. Joshua, perhaps influenced by the optimism of his commanders, decided to attack Ai with only a small force. Why risk the lives of thousands of men when a few hundred might suffice? The military logic seemed sound. The city appeared vulnerable. The enemy was presumably demoralized by news of Jericho's fall, and the Israelites had momentum on their side. Therefore, Joshua dispatched about 3,000 men to take what appeared to be an easy target. The attack on Ai began like so many military operations throughout history, with careful planning and high hopes. The Israelite force approached the city at dawn, expecting to find defenders who would quickly surrender or flee. Instead, they encountered fierce resistance from men who had no intention of sharing Jericho's fate. The battle that followed shattered Israelite assumptions about their invincibility and taught them harsh lessons about the dangers of overconfidence. The defenders of Ai, led by a king whose name history has not preserved, fought with the desperation of men who knew their lives depended on victory. They had heard the stories of Jericho's destruction, of the complete annihilation of its population, and they understood that surrender was not an option. This knowledge gave them a ferocity that the Israelites had not expected, transforming what should have been a simple conquest into a brutal struggle for survival. The battle turned against the Israelites when the defenders launched a counterattack that caught them by surprise. The men of Ai, fighting on familiar ground and motivated by desperation, managed to break through the Israelite lines and force them to retreat. This retreat quickly became a rout as panic spread through the attacking force. 36 Israelites died in the fighting, a small number by the standards of ancient warfare, but a psychological blow that shattered the confidence of the entire army. The defeat at Ai created a crisis that went far beyond military considerations. The Israelites had believed that their God was fighting for them, that their victories were evidence of divine favor. The failure at Ai raised terrible questions about whether that favor had been withdrawn and whether they had somehow offended the deity who had brought them out of Egypt and given them victory at Jericho. The theological implications of defeat were perhaps more devastating than the military consequences. Joshua's response to the defeat reveals the depth of his despair. He tore his clothes, put dust on his head, and fell face down before the Ark of the Covenant, displaying the traditional signs of mourning and repentance. His prayer expresses the anguish of a leader who has staked everything on divine support and suddenly finds that support in question. Why had God allowed this defeat? What had gone wrong with the divine plan for the conquest of Canaan? The answer, according to the biblical account, lay in the violation of divine commands that had accompanied the victory at Jericho. The wealth of that city had been dedicated to God, forbidden to the Israelite soldiers who had risked their lives to capture it. But someone had violated this prohibition, taking gold and silver and fine clothing for personal use. This act of disobedience, committed in secret, had consequences that affected the entire community. The search for the guilty party reveals the collective responsibility that characterized Israelite society. The sin of one individual was seen as contaminating the entire group, making all of them liable for divine punishment. This understanding of communal guilt and collective responsibility would shape Israelite culture for centuries to come, creating a society in which individual actions were always understood to have consequences for the broader community. Achan, the man identified as the thief, came from the tribe of Judah and had fought bravely at Jericho. His crime was not cowardice or betrayal, but simple greed, the desire to possess beautiful things that he had risked his life to capture. His confession reveals the human dimension of this ancient drama. When he saw a beautiful Babylonian robe, 200 shekels of silver, and a wedge of gold among the spoils of Jericho, he could not resist taking them for himself. The punishment that followed was swift and terrible. Achan, along with his family and possessions, was stoned to death in a valley that would forever after be called the Valley of Achor, meaning trouble. This harsh justice, which seems cruel by modern standards, reflected the Israelite belief that the community's survival depended on absolute obedience to divine commands. The sin that had caused their defeat at Ai had to be purged completely before they could hope for renewed divine favor. With the community purified and divine favor restored, Joshua prepared for a second assault on Ai. This time, however, he would not make the mistake of underestimating his enemy. The entire Israelite army, some 30,000 men, would participate in the attack. More importantly, Joshua developed a sophisticated strategy that relied on deception rather than brute force, showing that he had learned from the earlier failure. The plan that Joshua devised was simple but effective. A large force would attack the city from the front, thus drawing the defenders out in pursuit when the Israelites feigned retreat. Meanwhile, a smaller force hidden behind the city would enter Ai when its gates were left undefended, setting fire to the buildings and cutting off the defenders' retreat. This pincer movement, a classic military tactic, showed that Joshua was not just a religious leader, but a skilled military commander who could adapt his strategies to changing circumstances. The Second Battle of Ai unfolded exactly as Joshua had planned. The defenders, emboldened by their earlier victory, pursued the retreating Israelites with enthusiasm, not realizing that they were being drawn into a trap. When the smoke began to rise from their burning city, They found themselves caught between two Israelite forces with no hope of escape. The king of Ai was captured alive and brought before Joshua, where he met the same fate that had befallen the defenders of Jericho. The destruction of Ai was as complete as that of Jericho, but it carried different symbolic meaning for the Israelites. Where Jericho had demonstrated the power of faith and obedience, Ai showed the consequences of disobedience and the importance of learning from failure. The city that had humiliated them in defeat became the site of their redemption, proof that setbacks could be overcome through repentance and renewed commitment to divine commands. The psychological impact of this victory was perhaps even greater than that of Jericho. The Israelites had faced defeat and despair, had questioned their own destiny and their God's faithfulness, and had emerged stronger than before. They had learned that victory was not automatic, that divine favor required human cooperation, and that success in the promised land would demand both faith and wisdom. These lessons would serve them well in the challenges that lay ahead. For the Canaanites watching these events unfold, the Second Battle of Ai carried an ominous message. The initial defeat had given some hope that these desert invaders might be stopped after all. The subsequent victory, achieved through superior tactics rather than divine intervention alone, suggested that the Israelites were learning to fight effectively in their new environment. The combination of religious fervor and military competence made them a far more dangerous enemy than anyone had initially realized. The ruins of Ai, like those of Jericho, would remain as a monument to the changing balance of power in Canaan. The city that had once controlled access to the Central Highlands now lay in ashes, its strategic position useless to its former inhabitants. The route into the heartland of Canaan lay open to the Israelite advance, and the other cities of the region began to calculate their chances of survival in this new and dangerous world. Gibeon, the deceptive pact. The delegation arrives at the Israelite camp dressed in the clothing of men who have traveled a great distance. Their sandals are worn through, their garments patched and faded by sun and weather. The bread they carry is moldy, their water skins cracked and mended many times over. They speak with the weariness of people who have journeyed for months to reach this place, who have risked everything to seek alliance with the mighty conquerors who have brought down Jericho and Ai. But these men are not distant travelers at all. They are Gibeonites, inhabitants of one of the most important cities in central Canaan, and they have traveled only a few miles from their homes to reach the Israelite camp. Their worn clothing is a disguise, their travel-stained appearance a carefully crafted deception, designed to save their city from the fate that has befallen Jericho and Ai. This is perhaps the most audacious diplomatic gambit in the ancient world, a desperate attempt to survive through wit rather than warfare. Gibeon stands as one of the great cities of Canaan, its importance derived not from size but from location and influence. Archaeological evidence suggests that it was larger than Jerusalem during this period, a major urban center that controlled important trade routes and commanded the loyalty of several smaller towns in the region. The Gibeonites are Hivites, one of the native peoples of Canaan, with their own traditions and their own gods. But they are also pragmatists who understand that survival sometimes requires difficult choices. The deception begins with the Gibeonites' claim to represent a distant nation that has heard of the Israelites' victories and wishes to make a treaty with them. They speak of their fear of the Israelite God, whose power has been demonstrated in the destruction of Jericho and Ai. They offer to become servants and vassals, seeking protection in exchange for submission. Their words are carefully chosen to appeal to Israelite pride, while concealing their true identity and location. Joshua and the Israelite leaders face a dilemma that will test their wisdom and their commitment to divine guidance. The law that Moses had given them forbade making treaties with the inhabitants of Canaan who were to be completely displaced from the promised land. But it said nothing about making alliances with distant peoples who posed no threat to Israelite settlement. Therefore, the Gibeonites' deception strikes at the heart of a legal loophole that the Israelites had not anticipated. The decision to accept the Gibeonite treaty reveals both the strengths and weaknesses of Israelite leadership. On one hand, it shows a willingness to consider peaceful solutions rather than relying solely on military conquest. The Israelites demonstrate that they can be merciful to those who acknowledge their God's power and submit to their authority. On the other hand, it reveals a failure to seek divine guidance before making crucial decisions, a reliance on human wisdom that proves inadequate to detect the deception. The treaty ceremony itself follows ancient diplomatic protocols that would have been familiar throughout the Near East. Oaths are sworn, agreements are sealed, and both parties commit themselves to mutual support and protection. The Gibeonites promise to serve the Israelites faithfully, while the Israelites promise to defend Gibeon against any enemies who might threaten it. These commitments, made in the sight of God and witnessed by both communities, create bonds that cannot easily be broken. The discovery of the deception comes 3 days later, when the Israelite army arrives at Gibeon and realizes that they have been tricked. The city that seems so distant is actually close at hand, its inhabitants the very Canaanites whom they were commanded to displace. The initial reaction is anger and a desire for revenge, but the oath that has been sworn cannot be violated without bringing divine punishment upon the oath breakers. The Israelites find themselves bound by their own words to protect the people who have deceived them. Joshua's response to this crisis reveals his growth as a leader and his commitment to keeping faith even when it has been obtained through deception. Rather than break the treaty and risk divine displeasure, he chooses to honor the agreement while imposing consequences for the deception. The Gibeonites will be preserved but reduced to perpetual servitude, becoming hewers of wood and drawers of water for the Israelite community and its religious institutions. This punishment, while harsh, represents a form of mercy that the other Canaanite cities have not received. The Gibeonites will lose their independence but keep their lives, will be reduced in status but allowed to maintain their existence as a people. Their city will survive while others burn. Their children will grow up in safety while other Canaanite children face an uncertain future. The price of survival is steep, but survival itself is precious beyond measure. The Gibeonite deception establishes a precedent that will influence future encounters between Israelites and Canaanites. It demonstrates that not all conflicts need to end in total destruction, that there are alternatives to the harsh choice between conquest and annihilation. Some Canaanite communities will learn from Gibeon's example, seeking their own accommodations with the Israelite invaders rather than fighting hopeless battles for independence. The treaty also creates new strategic realities that will shape the continuing conquest of Canaan. Gibeon's submission gives the Israelites a foothold in central Canaan and a base from which to launch further operations. But it also creates obligations that will draw them into conflicts with other Canaanite cities who see Gibeon's defection as a betrayal of their common cause. The alliance that was meant to bring peace will instead become a catalyst for larger wars. More importantly, the Gibeonite episode reveals the complex moral landscape that the Israelites must navigate as they establish themselves in their new homeland. The clear commands that guided them in the wilderness become more difficult to apply in the ambiguous situations that arise in settled life. The distinction between friend and enemy, between those who may be spared and those who must be destroyed, proves harder to maintain when faced with the cunning and desperation of people fighting for their survival. The Gibeonites themselves emerge from this episode as one of the most interesting groups in the biblical narrative. Their willingness to sacrifice their independence for survival shows a pragmatic wisdom that other Canaanite cities lack. Their successful deception demonstrates intelligence and courage of a different kind than that displayed on the battlefield. Their integration into Israelite society will prove that former enemies can become faithful allies when treated with justice and mercy. The 5 kings of the Amorites' word spreads through the hill country like fire through dry grass. The impossible has happened. Gibeon, one of the great cities of central Canaan, has submitted to the Israelite invaders without a fight. The news reaches the courts of kings and the councils of elders, creating shockwaves that ripple through the established order of Canaanite society. If Gibeon can fall through diplomacy, if the Hivites can abandon their ancestral independence, then no city can consider itself safe from the growing Israelite threat. Adonizedek, whose name means Lord of Righteousness, rules Jerusalem from his palace on the hill that will one day support Solomon's temple. He is an Amorite king, descendant of the people who swept into Canaan centuries earlier and established themselves as rulers over many of its cities. His kingdom, though centered on Jerusalem, extends its influence throughout the southern hill country, making him one of the most powerful rulers in the region. The defection of Gibeon threatens not just his strategic position, but his entire understanding of how the world should work. The other kings who answer Adonizedek's call to war represent the cream of Amorite nobility. Hoham of Hebron rules from a city that will later become David's first capital, a place already ancient when these events unfold. Piram of Jarmuth controls territory that guards the approaches to the coastal plain. Japhia of Lachish commands perhaps the strongest fortress in southern Canaan. Debir of Eglon rounds out this coalition of rulers who represent the established order that the Israelites threaten to overturn. These are not merely local chieftains, but sophisticated rulers who preside over complex urban societies. Their cities boast impressive fortifications, skilled craftsmen, and extensive trade networks that stretch from Egypt to Mesopotamia. They worship gods whose temples have stood for centuries, follow legal traditions that have proven their worth through generations of practice, and maintain diplomatic relationships with the great powers of their age. The challenge they face from the Israelites is not just military, but cultural, a threat to an entire way of life. The decision to form a coalition against the Israelites reflects both the wisdom and the limitations of Amorite political thinking. These kings understand that they are stronger together than apart, that the fall of one city weakens all the others, that cooperation is essential for survival. But their alliance is fragile, held together by immediate necessity rather than long-term shared interests. Each king remains focused primarily on protecting his own territory and subjects, making unified strategy difficult to achieve. The plan that emerges from their war council is both logical and fatally flawed. Rather than attack the Israelites directly, they will first punish Gibeon for its betrayal, making an example that will discourage other cities from seeking similar accommodations with the invaders. This strategy aims to restore the psychological balance that Gibeon's defection has upset, demonstrating that submission to the Israelites brings punishment rather than protection. But it also forces the Israelites to honor their treaty obligations, drawing them into a battle at a time and place of the coalition's choosing. The march against Gibeon becomes a test of Amorite military capability and political unity. The combined armies of the five kings represent one of the largest military forces assembled in Canaan during this period. Their soldiers carry the finest bronze weapons. Their officers have trained in the military academies of Egypt and Mesopotamia. Their supply trains include all the equipment needed for a prolonged siege. This is the professional military power of the Bronze Age world arrayed against a people who learned warfare in the wilderness. The siege of Gibeon begins with all the ceremony and ritual that accompany formal warfare in the ancient world. Heralds proclaim the justice of the coalition's cause, priests offer sacrifices to ensure divine favor, and engineers begin the slow work of undermining the city's defenses. The Gibeonites, trapped behind their walls, face the terrible consequences of their diplomatic gamble. They have chosen the Israelites over their fellow Canaanites, and now they must discover whether their new allies will honor the treaty that protects them. The Gibeonite plea for help reaches Joshua at Gilgal, where the Israelite army has established its base of operations. The message is urgent and desperate. The five kings have surrounded their city, and their walls cannot hold out indefinitely against such a large force. If the Israelites do not come quickly, Gibeon will fall, and its people will face the same destruction that befell Jericho and Ai. The treaty that was obtained through deception now demands payment in Israelite blood and treasure. Joshua's response reveals both his military genius and his commitment to keeping faith, even with former enemies. Despite the risks involved in marching against such a large coalition, despite the strategic disadvantages of fighting a battle at the enemy's chosen time and place, he chooses to honor the treaty with Gibeon. The decision reflects not just legal obligation, but moral conviction. A people who break their word, even when that word was obtained through deception, cannot expect their own God to keep faith with them. The night march from Gilgal to Gibeon becomes one of the epic military movements of ancient history. The Israelite army, moving with the speed and stealth that they learned in their wilderness wanderings, covers the distance in darkness, arriving at Gibeon just as dawn breaks over the besieging coalition. The element of surprise, combined with the Israelites' reputation for supernatural assistance, creates panic among the coalition forces that have confidently expected an easy victory over the isolated city. The arrival of the Israelite relief force transforms a siege into a field battle, changing all the strategic calculations that the five kings have made. Instead of fighting from prepared positions against a trapped enemy, they find themselves facing fresh troops in open combat. The psychological advantage shifts dramatically as the besiegers become the besieged, surrounded by enemies on all sides with no secure line of retreat. The trap that was meant to catch the Gibeonites instead snares their would-be destroyers. The coalition's military advantages prove less decisive than their commanders had hoped. Bronze weapons and professional training matter less when armies are surprised and demoralized. Chariots, the tanks of the ancient world, become liabilities rather than assets when fighting in broken terrain against infantry that refuses to panic. The technological superiority that has sustained Canaanite military dominance for centuries suddenly seems inadequate against an enemy that fights with different rules and different motivations. The battle that follows will be remembered not just for its immediate military consequences, but for the supernatural events that reportedly accompany it. The sun stands still, hailstones fall from heaven, and the pursuing Israelites seem to possess superhuman endurance. Whether these phenomena have natural explanations or represent direct divine intervention, they contribute to a victory so complete that coalition forces are not just defeated, but destroyed, their power broken permanently. The sun stands still. The battle rages through the morning hours as Joshua's forces press their advantage against the coalition of five kings. What began as a surprise attack on the besieging armies has become a running battle across the hills and valleys of central Canaan. The Amorite forces, caught off guard and demoralized by the sudden appearance of the Israelite relief army, flee westward toward the coastal plain, hoping to reach the safety of their own territories before their pursuers can overtake them. But daylight, that most precious commodity in ancient warfare, threatens to slip away before the victory can be completed. The sun climbs toward its zenith and then begins its inevitable descent toward the western horizon. In a few hours, darkness will end the pursuit and allow the scattered remnants of the coalition to escape, regroup, and perhaps fight another day. Joshua, watching his opportunity for decisive victory slipping away with the fading light, calls upon his God to perform a miracle that will echo through the ages. The prayer that Joshua offers in the midst of battle reflects both the desperation of the moment and the audacious faith that has carried the Israelites through their conquest of Canaan. He asks for nothing less than the suspension of natural law, for the sun and moon to halt their courses through the heavens until his victory is complete. This is not a request for military assistance or divine guidance, but a plea for cosmic intervention, for the creator of the universe, to alter the fundamental order of creation for the sake of one day's battle. The biblical account records that Joshua's prayer was answered in a way that defied all human understanding. The sun stood still in the midst of the heavens and did not hasten to set for about a whole day. The moon also stopped in its course, creating a prolonged daylight that allowed the Israelite pursuit to continue far longer than would normally be possible. This miraculous extension of daylight enabled the complete destruction of the coalition forces and secured one of the most decisive victories in the entire conquest narrative. Modern readers struggle with the literal interpretation of this account, searching for natural explanations that might make sense of what seems scientifically impossible. Some scholars suggest that unusual atmospheric conditions could have created the illusion of extended daylight. Others propose that the text describes a poetic exaggeration of a particularly long and successful day of battle, Still others argue that the miracle should be understood as a localized phenomenon affecting only the perception of those involved in the fighting. The astronomical implications of a literal interpretation are staggering. For the sun to stand still would require either the Earth to stop rotating or the entire solar system to be held in supernatural suspension. Such an event would have consequences far beyond the battlefield in Canaan, affecting every civilization on Earth and leaving traces in astronomical records from Egypt to China. The absence of such records in the historical sources of other ancient peoples has led many scholars to seek alternative interpretations of the biblical text. Yet the religious significance of the account transcends its scientific plausibility. Whether understood literally or symbolically, the story of the sun standing still represents the ultimate expression of divine power on behalf of the chosen people. It suggests that the God of Israel is not bound by the natural laws that govern ordinary human experience, that divine intervention can alter the very fabric of reality when necessary to accomplish divine purposes. This understanding of God's unlimited power became a cornerstone of Israelite faith for centuries to come. The military consequences of the extended daylight, however interpreted, were decisive and far-reaching. The coalition forces, already demoralized by their initial defeat, found themselves unable to escape the relentless Israelite pursuit. Soldiers who might have reached safety under cover of darkness were overtaken and destroyed in the pitiless light of the supernatural day. The carefully planned alliance that was meant to stop the Israelite advance instead became the instrument of its own destruction. The book of Jasher, mentioned in the biblical account as a source for this story, represents one of the lost literary treasures of ancient Israel. This collection of heroic poetry apparently preserved many of the great military achievements of the conquest period in verse form that was easier to memorize and transmit than prose narratives. The reference to this lost book suggests that the story of the sun standing still was not just historical record, but also popular legend, a tale told and retold around campfires and in royal courts throughout the ancient Near East. The psychological impact of this victory on both Israelites and Canaanites cannot be overstated. For the Israelites, it provided definitive proof that their God was more powerful than all the gods of Canaan combined, that divine favor could overcome any human obstacle. The story became a source of inspiration for later generations facing their own impossible challenges, a reminder that faith could move mountains and stop the sun itself. For the Canaanites, it demonstrated that resistance to the Israelite advance was not just futile, but potentially catastrophic. The pursuit continues through the miraculous daylight as the Israelite forces track down the fleeing coalition troops. The route of the chase leads through some of the most strategically important territory in ancient Palestine, past cities that will feature prominently in later biblical narratives. Each mile of pursuit brings the Israelites deeper into the heart of Canaan, extending their control and demonstrating their dominance over the established powers of the region. The hailstones that reportedly fell during the pursuit add another supernatural element to an already extraordinary battle. These were not ordinary hailstones, but devastating projectiles that were more effective at destroying the enemy than the swords of the Israelite soldiers. The text notes that more died from the hailstones than from conventional weapons, suggesting that natural forces themselves had joined the battle on behalf of the Israelites. This meteorological warfare reinforced the impression that the very heavens were fighting against the coalition. The five kings themselves, the architects of the doomed alliance, meet a fate that reflects both their courage and their folly. Rather than fleeing to safety with their surviving troops, they attempt to hide in a cave at Makkedah, perhaps hoping to escape notice until they can rally their forces for another attempt at resistance. Their capture and execution become a symbolic act that demonstrates the complete collapse of organized resistance to the Israelite conquest in southern Canaan. The victory at Gibeon, climaxed by the miracle of the sun standing still, marks a turning point in the conquest narrative. The psychological warfare that began with the fall of Jericho reaches its culmination in a battle where divine intervention becomes so obvious that even the enemies of Israel cannot deny its reality. The established order of Canaanite society, already shaken by earlier Israelite victories, now faces the prospect of total collapse in the face of an enemy that seems to command the very forces of nature. The long day of Joshua becomes a reference point for measuring the power of faith and the reality of divine intervention. Whether understood as literal history or powerful metaphor, it represents the moment when human limitations gave way to divine possibilities, when the normal constraints of time and space yielded to the urgent necessities of conquest and settlement. In the lengthened shadows of that supernatural sunset, the future of Canaan was decided not by human strength or cunning, but by the will of a God who could command the sun to stand still. The southern campaign, Joshua's army moved like a tide across the southern hills. Victory at Gibeon had opened pathways that led deeper into Canaan's heart. The Amorite kings lay defeated, their coalition shattered. Yet the land held more secrets, more cities wrapped in stone and shadow. The southern campaign began with methodical precision. Each city presented unique challenges. Lachish stood behind massive walls that scraped the sky. Hebron nestled among ancient oaks where giants once walked. Eglon perched on hills that commanded trade routes stretching toward Egypt. These were not simple villages. Each city possessed its own character, its own gods, its own way of viewing the world. Lachish served as a fortress city, its walls thick enough for chariots to race along the top. Merchants from across the known world gathered in its markets. Gold from Nubia, silver from Anatolia, cedar from Lebanon. Hebron carried deeper mysteries. Ancient burial caves lay beneath its foundations. The Anakim had made this place their stronghold for generations. Their massive bones rested in tombs carved from living rock. The city's name meant friendship in the old tongue, though no friendship awaited Joshua's approaching forces. Eglon commanded the western approaches. Its king had fallen at Gibeon, but the city itself remained defiant. Watchers on its walls could see Egyptian patrol boats moving along the distant coast. Perhaps help would come from the south. Perhaps the great Pharaoh would send his chariots to drive back these wilderness wanderers. The southern campaign unfolded with relentless momentum. Joshua divided his forces, striking multiple targets while preventing enemy cities from supporting each other. Communication between settlements grew impossible. Each city faced its fate alone. Lachish fell first among the great fortresses. The siege lasted days, not weeks. Joshua's forces had learned from previous battles. They understood how to breach walls, how to starve defenders, how to break the will of those who opposed them. The city's massive gates, reinforced with bronze and iron, could not hold forever. Hebron's surrender came through negotiation rather than siege. The giants' descendants saw what had befallen their neighbors. They chose survival over honor. Ancient burial sites remained undisturbed, though new masters now walked the streets where Anakim once ruled. Eglon's resistance proved fierce but brief. The city's warriors fought with desperate courage, knowing their Egyptian allies would not arrive in time. The battle ended when flames consumed the palace complex. Smoke rose like a signal fire, visible from settlements throughout the southern hills. Each victory brought new challenges. Captured cities required garrisons, populations needed management. Some surrendered willingly, accepting new rulers in exchange for protection. Others scattered into the wilderness, carrying grudges that would simmer for generations. The Southern Campaign transformed the political landscape. Egyptian influence, once dominant throughout the region, began to wane. Trade routes shifted toward Israelite-controlled territories. Merchant caravans now sought permission from Joshua's administrators rather than Egyptian governors. Local gods witnessed their temples emptied, their statues toppled, Baal's shrines fell silent. Asherah poles burned in ceremonial fires. The spiritual transformation proved as complete as the military conquest. New songs echoed through streets where ancient hymns once honored forgotten deities. Yet not everything changed. Local craftsmen continued their work. Farmers tended the same fields their ancestors had cultivated. Olive groves and vineyards produced harvests that fed both conquerors and conquered. The land itself endured, indifferent to the changing banners that flew from its hilltops. The Southern Campaign's success created momentum that carried Joshua's forces toward even greater challenges. Northern kings watched with growing alarm as city after city fell to these wilderness warriors. The time for half measures had passed. A greater coalition would be needed to stop the Israelite advance. Lachish, the impenetrable fortress. Lachish rose from the Shephelah like a mountain built by human hands. Its walls stretched skyward, layer upon layer of perfectly fitted stones. No other city in Canaan commanded such respect, such fear. Merchants spoke of its defenses in whispered conversations. Armies changed their routes to avoid its shadow. The city's position made it nearly untouchable. Natural hills provided the foundation for artificial terraces that climbed toward the central citadel. Each level contained its own walls, its own gates, its own garrison. Attackers would need to capture 7 separate defensive lines before reaching the palace complex. Water flowed through hidden channels carved from solid rock. Even during the driest seasons, Lachish never thirsted. Springs within the city provided enough fresh water to sustain thousands of defenders for months. The engineers who designed these systems had learned from centuries of siege warfare. Lachish served as more than a fortress. Its markets drew traders from across the ancient world. Egyptian gold changed hands in its courtyards. Mesopotamian silver filled its treasury vaults. The city's wealth rivaled that of nations, not mere settlements. The king of Lachish had died at Gibeon, but his generals understood their duty. They would hold the city until Egyptian reinforcements arrived. Pharaoh's promises carried weight in these southern lands. The great empire would not abandon its most important vassal cities. Joshua's scouts reported what they saw. The walls stretched higher than any structure they had encountered. The gates gleamed with bronze reinforcements. Defenders moved along the ramparts with practiced discipline. This would not be another Jericho, where divine intervention brought swift victory. The siege began with careful preparation. Joshua's engineers studied the terrain, identifying weak points in the city's defenses. They built ramps of earth and stone, creating pathways that climbed toward the outer walls. The work progressed slowly, deliberately. Lachish's defenders responded with their own engineering. They dug tunnels beneath the Israelite siege works, then filled them with combustible materials. Flames erupted from the earth, destroying weeks of careful construction. The siege ramps collapsed, burying workers beneath tons of rubble. The battle became a contest of innovation. Joshua's forces developed new techniques for breaching walls. They built wheeled towers that could roll against the fortifications. These wooden structures rose as high as the city's ramparts, allowing attackers to fight on level ground. Lachish's archers turned these towers into funeral pyres. Fire arrows ignited the wooden frameworks. Burning debris rained down on the attackers below. The siege stretched from days into weeks, then from weeks into months. Within the city, supplies began to dwindle. The hidden water channels still flowed, but food stores emptied steadily. Children grew thin. The elderly weakened. Still, the defenders held their posts, watching the horizon for Egyptian chariots that never appeared. The final assault came not through the main gates, but through a breach in the northern wall. Joshua's miners had worked for weeks, tunneling beneath the foundations. When they set fire to the wooden supports, an entire section of wall collapsed. Israelite warriors poured through the gap before the defenders could respond. The outer defenses fell quickly once the walls were breached. The second ring of fortifications held longer, but weight of numbers eventually told. By sunset, Lachish's great citadel flew new banners. The city's fall sent shockwaves throughout the region. If mighty Lachish could not withstand the Israelite assault, what hope did smaller settlements possess? Surrender became a viable option for cities that had previously sworn to fight to the end. Archaeological evidence from later centuries reveals the scope of Lachish's destruction. Layers of ash and debris tell the story of a city that burned for days. Arrowheads and spear points lie scattered through the ruins. The siege ramps still rise toward walls that no longer exist. Yet Lachish would rise again. Its strategic position proved too valuable to abandon. New settlers rebuilt the city, creating fresh defenses on the ancient foundations. The great fortress would witness many more sieges in centuries to come, playing its role in the endless drama of conquest and resistance. Hebron, city of the giants. Hebron rested among oak groves that had watched the world grow old. These trees remembered when the first wanderers discovered the hidden valley. Their roots drank from springs that never failed, even when the surrounding hills baked under merciless sun. The city itself seemed to grow from the earth like another tree, its walls following the natural contours of the land. Ancient legends spoke of giants who once ruled this place. The Anakim had built their stronghold here, carving chambers from living rock. Their bones lay in tombs that stretched deep beneath the city's foundations. Local children whispered stories of the tall ones who could lift boulders with their bare hands. Abraham himself had walked these streets. His purchase of the cave of Machpelah had given his descendants a claim to this land that stretched back through centuries. The burial place of the patriarchs lay within Hebron's walls, making this city sacred to the wandering tribes that followed Joshua. The city's character differed from other Canaanite settlements. Where Lachish emphasized military might, Hebron focused on commerce and scholarship. Its libraries contained scrolls written in languages that predated the flood. Scribes from across the known world came to study its ancient texts. Hebron's walls rose from foundations laid by the Anakim. These massive stones fitted together without mortar, their surfaces polished smooth by generations of weathering. Local masons claimed the blocks were too heavy for normal humans to move. Only the giants possessed the strength to build such monuments. The city's population included descendants of many peoples. Hittites managed the northern trade routes. Amorites controlled the southern approaches. Canaanites proper tended the sacred groves and maintained the ancient temples. This diversity created a unique culture that blended traditions from across the ancient world. Hebron's king had fallen at Gibeon, but his heir understood the gravity of the situation. The city's defenses could not match those of Lachish. Its walls, while impressive, were built for ceremony rather than siege warfare. The population included too many scholars and merchants, too few professional soldiers. Joshua's approach to Hebron differed from his tactics at other cities. He sent envoys bearing terms of surrender. The city could submit peacefully, preserving its libraries and sacred sites. The alternative was siege, destruction, and the loss of irreplaceable knowledge. The debates within Hebron's council chambers continued for days. Older members remembered Abraham's promise that his descendants would inherit this land. Perhaps the time had come to acknowledge that inheritance. Younger voices called for resistance, arguing that submission would dishonor their ancestors. The deciding factor came from an unexpected source. The city's oldest priest, keeper of the Machpelah cave, declared that the spirits of the patriarchs favored peaceful surrender. He had consulted the ancient bones, he claimed, and received clear guidance from beyond the grave. Hebron's gates opened without battle. Joshua's forces entered the city as honored guests rather than conquerors. The transition of power occurred with dignity, preserving the city's scholarly traditions while acknowledging new political realities. The ancient burial caves remained undisturbed. Joshua himself visited the Machpelah, paying respects to the patriarchs whose descendants now controlled the city. The moment carried deep significance for both conquerors and conquered, linking present events to promises made in the distant past. Hebron's surrender influenced other cities throughout the region. If the scholarly center could accept Israelite rule, perhaps accommodation offered better prospects than resistance. The city's example demonstrated that conquest need not mean destruction, that wisdom sometimes counseled submission over defiance. The giants' descendants found new roles in the changing world. Their knowledge of ancient texts proved valuable to the new administrators. Their understanding of trade routes helped maintain commercial connections. The bloodline that had once ruled through strength now served through scholarship. Hebron's transformation reflected broader changes sweeping through Canaan. The old order was passing away, replaced by new structures of power and authority. Yet continuity persisted alongside change. The ancient oaks still shaded the city's courts. The sacred springs still provided water for daily life. The eternal elements endured while human arrangements shifted like sand. The city's peaceful surrender created a model for other settlements. Resistance might bring glory, but accommodation ensured survival. Hebron's libraries remained intact, its scholars continued their work, its merchants adapted to new trade patterns. The giants' legacy lived on through wisdom rather than warfare. Northern resistance, the Canaanite megacity. States' news of the southern campaign's success traveled faster than Joshua's armies. Messengers on swift horses carried word from city to city, describing the fall of mighty Lachish and the surrender of ancient Hebron. The southern kingdoms had collapsed like towers built on sand. The northern cities possessed advantages their southern neighbors had lacked. Hazor commanded trade routes that stretched from Egypt to Mesopotamia. Its wealth exceeded that of many nations. Medan controlled the fertile valleys where grain grew thick as hair. Shimron's artisans crafted weapons that could cut through bronze like butter. These cities formed a different kind of civilization. Where southern settlements focused on defense, northern centers emphasized commerce and craftsmanship. Their populations included skilled workers from across the ancient world. Phoenician shipbuilders lived alongside Hittite metalworkers. Egyptian scribes collaborated with Mesopotamian astronomers. The northern kings understood that individual resistance would fail. The southern campaign had demonstrated Joshua's tactical superiority. No single city could withstand the force that had conquered Lachish. Only united action offered hope of turning back the Israelite tide. Jabin, king of Hazor, assumed leadership of the northern coalition. His city's wealth provided resources for the war effort. His diplomatic connections brought support from distant allies. Messages traveled north to Phoenician cities, east to Mesopotamian kingdoms, south to Egyptian garrison commanders. The coalition's military preparations impressed even veteran observers. Hazor's armories produced weapons in quantities that staggered the imagination. Spears and swords accumulated in vast warehouses. Arrows filled entire storage buildings. The sound of hammers on metal echoed through the city's streets from dawn to dusk. Chariots represented the coalition's greatest advantage. These vehicles had revolutionized warfare across the ancient world. A single chariot could scatter 100 infantry soldiers. The northern cities possessed chariots by the thousands, plus horses trained for battle and drivers skilled in their use. The coalition's infantry forces matched anything the southern kingdoms had fielded. Professional soldiers formed the core of each city's army. These men had trained for warfare since childhood, mastering weapons and tactics that had evolved over generations. They wore armor crafted by master smiths, carried shields that could turn aside bronze arrows. Mercenary companies swelled the coalition's ranks. Gold flowed from Hazor's treasury to hire the finest fighters available. Nubian archers brought their powerful bows. Philistine swordsmen contributed their legendary ferocity. Hittite heavy infantry provided disciplined formations that could hold any ground. The northern cities' defensive preparations exceeded their military recruitment. Engineers strengthened walls and gates. Architects designed killing fields where attackers would face crossfire from multiple directions. Supply depots accumulated food and water to sustain lengthy sieges. The coalition's strategy reflected careful planning. Rather than wait for Joshua's attack, they would strike first. The combined armies would march south, crushing the Israelite forces before they could adapt to new tactics. Victory would restore the old order, driving the invaders back into the wilderness. Intelligence networks provided detailed information about Joshua's movements. Spies reported on Israelite strengths and weaknesses. The wilderness wanderers possessed few chariots, limited armor, outdated weapons. Their victories had depended on surprise and divine intervention rather than military superiority. The Northern Coalition represented Canaan's last hope for independence. These cities commanded resources that dwarfed anything the Israelites possessed. Their armies included the finest warriors in the known world. Their defensive positions seemed impregnable. Their cause appeared just. Yet doubts lingered beneath the surface confidence. The southern cities had possessed similar advantages. Their walls had been equally strong, their armies equally brave. Divine forces seemed to favor the Israelite cause, providing victories that defied military logic. The coalition's leaders dismissed such concerns as superstition. War was a matter of numbers, equipment, and tactics. The northern cities possessed clear advantages in every category. The wilderness wanderers had enjoyed surprising success, but their luck would end when they faced professional armies on chosen ground. Preparations neared completion as spring turned towards summer. The greatest military force in Canaan's history would soon march south. The fate of the ancient world hung in the balance, waiting for the clash that would determine whether the old gods or the new would rule the promised land. Hazor, the crown jewel of Canaan. Hazor sprawled across the northern hills like a great beast resting in the sun. Its walls encompassed territory that could hold 10 ordinary cities. 20,000 people lived within its protective embrace, making it the largest settlement in all Canaan. The city's very existence challenged the imagination. The lower cities stretched across fertile plains where farmers grew crops that fed the entire region. Olive groves and vineyards covered the surrounding hills in neat rows. Grain fields waved like green seas in the spring breeze. Hazor's agricultural wealth exceeded that of entire kingdoms. The upper city crowned a natural hill that commanded views in every direction. From its highest towers, watchmen could see the snowy peaks of Mount Hermon to the north, the gleaming waters of the Sea of Galilee to the east, the Mediterranean coastline to the west. No enemy could approach without warning. Hazor's markets buzzed with activity that never ceased. Merchants from Mesopotamia traded silver for Phoenician purple. Egyptian gold purchased cedar from Lebanon. Exotic spices from distant lands filled the air with fragrances that spoke of wealth beyond measure. The city's palaces rivaled those of the greatest empires. King Jabin's residence contained rooms that could house entire villages. Its walls displayed artwork created by master craftsmen from across the ancient world. Gold leaf covered surfaces that reflected light like captured sunbeams. Hazor's military strength matched its commercial success. The city's armories contained weapons enough to equip armies from multiple nations. Its stables housed hundreds of war horses, trained from birth for battle. Its workshops produced the finest chariots in the known world. The city's religious complex honored gods from every corner of the ancient world. Baal's temple rose like a mountain of carved stone. Asherah's sacred grove provided shade for worshippers who came from distant lands. Altars dedicated to Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and Hittite deities demonstrated the city's cosmopolitan character. Hazor's libraries preserved knowledge that stretched back to the beginning of time. Clay tablets recorded laws, customs, and wisdom from civilizations that had vanished into legend. Scholars traveled from across the known world to study these ancient texts. The city's population included representatives of every known people. Phoenicians managed the maritime trade routes. Hittites controlled the northern passes. Egyptians supervised the southern approaches. Arameans handled the eastern caravan routes. This diversity created a unique culture that blended traditions from across the ancient world. Hazor's defensive preparations reflected its wealth and importance. The city's walls rose higher than any others in Canaan. Its gates gleamed with bronze reinforcements. Its towers provided platforms for the finest archers in the region. No enemy had ever breached these defenses. The city's water supply came from springs that never failed, even during the worst droughts. Hidden channels carried fresh water to every district. Emergency reserves could sustain the population for months. Siege warfare held no terrors for Hazor's defenders. King Jabin commanded respect that extended far beyond his city's walls. His messengers carried authority throughout the region. His gold influenced decisions in distant capitals. His armies could tip the balance of power in any regional conflict. The Northern Coalition gathered in Hazor's courtyards like rivers flowing toward the sea. Warriors from every city in the region answered Jabin's call. The sight of so many armed men filled the streets with an energy that seemed to make the very stones vibrate. Hazor's armories emptied as weapons flowed to the coalition forces. Chariots rolled through the gates in columns that stretched beyond the horizon. The sound of marching feet echoed off the city's walls like thunder that would not end. The city's priests performed sacrifices that would ensure divine favor. Baal's altar ran red with blood from 100 bulls. Asherah's grove echoed with hymns that had been sung since the world began. The gods of Canaan would surely protect their most magnificent city. Hazor stood at the center of the ancient world's attention. The fate of civilizations would be decided by events that began within its walls. The crown jewel of Canaan prepared to lead the final resistance against the wilderness wanderers who threatened to overturn the established order. The chariot armies of Canaan. The ground trembled beneath thousands of wheels as the Northern Coalition assembled its greatest weapon. Chariots stretched across the plain like a mechanical forest, their bronze fittings gleaming in the morning sun. These vehicles represented the pinnacle of military technology, the ultimate expression of Canaanite power. Each chariot was a masterpiece of engineering. Skilled craftsmen had shaped every component with precision that bordered on artistry. The wheels bore bronze rims that could crush bones beneath their weight. The axles were forged from iron that would not bend under the stress of battle. The bodies were crafted from wood that grew only in the mountains of Lebanon. 2 horses pulled each chariot, animals bred for speed and courage. These beasts had been trained from birth to charge into battle without fear. Their bloodlines traced back to the finest steeds of Egypt and Mesopotamia. Their hooves had been shod with bronze that would not wear down on rocky ground. The chariot crews represented the elite of Canaanite society. Drivers came from families that had served in this role for generations. Their hands could guide a chariot through the chaos of battle with skill that seemed supernatural. They knew every sound their horses made, every nuance of movement that indicated danger or opportunity. Archers rode beside the drivers, men whose accuracy with the bow approached legendary status. They could hit targets while their chariots bounced over rough terrain at full speed. Their arrows were tipped with bronze points could pierce the finest armor. Their quivers held enough ammunition to sustain combat for hours. The chariot's tactical advantages seemed overwhelming. They could move faster than any infantry formation, striking where enemies least expected. They could withdraw from losing battles, regrouping for fresh attacks. They could trample foot soldiers who stood in their path, scattering formations like leaves in a windstorm. Chariot warfare required careful coordination. The vehicles fought in formations that maximized their impact while minimizing their vulnerability. Skilled commanders positioned their chariots to support each other, creating interlocking fields of fire that could devastate enemy forces. The Northern Coalition possessed chariots by the thousands. Hazor alone contributed 500 vehicles to the alliance. Smaller cities added their own squadrons, creating a force that dwarfed anything the region had ever seen. The sound of their approach would be heard from miles away. The chariots' crews wore armor that reflected the finest metalworking techniques. Bronze scales covered their bodies like the skin of mythical dragons. Helmets shaped like animal heads protected their skulls while striking fear into enemy hearts. Their shields bore designs that proclaimed their city's glory. Maintenance of such a force required resources that only the wealthiest cities could provide. Each chariot needed daily attention from skilled mechanics. The horses required fodder that cost more than most people's annual income. The bronze fittings needed constant polishing to prevent corrosion. The coalition's strategy centered on the chariot advantage. These vehicles would lead the assault, breaking enemy formations before the infantry advanced. Their speed would prevent the Israelites from choosing favorable ground. Their firepower would thin enemy ranks before close combat began. The psychological impact of mass chariots could not be underestimated. The thunder of wheels and hooves created a sound that weakened enemy resolve. The sight of hundreds of vehicles charging in formation had broken armies before the first arrow was fired. Terror was a weapon as sharp as any blade. The chariots represented more than military might. They symbolized the established order, the civilization that had flourished in Canaan for centuries. Their bronze and iron embodied the technological achievements of settled peoples. Their trained crews demonstrated the superiority of professional armies. The wilderness wanderers possessed no chariots of their own. Their forces relied on foot soldiers armed with simple weapons. They had no experience fighting against massed cavalry charges. Their victories had come against cities that fought defensive battles, not mobile campaigns. The Northern Coalition's confidence rested on this technological advantage. The chariots would sweep the Israelite forces from the field like wheat before the scythe. The ancient gods of Canaan would triumph over the upstart deity of the wilderness wanderers. The natural order would be restored. Yet history had shown that technological advantages could be overcome by superior tactics, better leadership, and divine favor. The chariot armies of Canaan were magnificent, but magnificence alone had never guaranteed victory. The coming battle would test whether bronze and iron could triumph over faith and determination. The waters of Merom. The call to battle echoed across the northern territories like thunder rolling down from the mountains. King Jabin's messengers had carried word to every allied city, every friendly tribe, every mercenary company within reach. The greatest army in Canaan's history would gather at the waters of Merom. The lake itself reflected the sky like a mirror of polished bronze. Its shores provided space for the massive encampment that would house the coalition forces. Fresh water flowed in abundance from mountain springs. Grass grew thick enough to feed thousands of horses. The location seemed blessed by the gods themselves. Jabin's army arrived first, their banners streaming in the morning breeze. The sight of so many chariots created a forest of wheels and spears that stretched beyond the horizon. The sound of their approach had carried for miles, a rumble that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. The armies of Madon came next, their warriors singing ancient battle songs. Their king rode at their head, his armor gleaming like captured sunlight. His chariots were fewer than Jabin's, but crafted with equal skill. The bronze fittings on their wheels threw sparks when they rolled across stone. Shimron's forces brought weapons that surpassed anything the coalition had seen. Their swords could cut through bronze like butter. Their spears were tipped with iron that would not bend or break. Their archers carried bows that could drive arrows through the thickest armor. The mercenary companies arrived in smaller groups, their diversity adding color to the great gathering. Nubian archers brought their powerful bows and accurate aim. Philistine swordsmen contributed their legendary ferocity. Hittite heavy infantry provided disciplined formations that could hold any ground. The coalition's total strength exceeded anything the region had ever witnessed. Historians would later estimate the force at over 20,000 warriors, supported by hundreds of chariots and thousands of horses. The camp stretched for miles along the lake's shoreline. The army's preparation for battle revealed the scope of Canaanite military sophistication. Engineers surveyed the terrain, identifying the best positions for chariot charges. Scouts mapped every path and stream in the surrounding area. Supply officers calculated the resources needed to sustain such a massive force. The coalition's strategy reflected careful planning and overwhelming confidence. The chariots would lead the assault, breaking enemy formations with their initial charge. The infantry would follow, exploiting the gaps created by the mounted attack. The Israelite forces would be swept from the field like leaves in a windstorm. Religious ceremonies preceded the military preparations. Priests from every city in the coalition performed sacrifices to ensure divine favor. Baal's altar ran red with blood from hundreds of animals. Asherah's sacred groves echoed with hymns that had been sung since the world began. The coalition's commanders met in Jabin's tent, their faces lit by oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on the walls. Maps covered every surface, showing the terrain where the battle would be fought. Weapons lay ready for inspection, their bronze points gleaming in the flickering light. Intelligence reports indicated that Joshua's forces were approaching from the south. The Israelite army was smaller than expected, lacking the chariots and professional soldiers that made up the coalition's strength. Their victories had been won through surprise and divine intervention, rather than military superiority. The northern kings dismissed such concerns as superstition. War was a matter of numbers, equipment, and tactics. The coalition possessed clear advantages in every category. The wilderness wanderers had enjoyed surprising success, but their luck would end when they faced professional armies on chosen ground. The final preparations took on an almost ceremonial character. Weapons were blessed by priests, horses were adorned with sacred symbols, chariots were polished until they gleamed like mirrors. The greatest army in Canaan's history would fight with every advantage that wealth and wisdom could provide. The waters of Merom reflected the campfires of the coalition as evening fell. Tomorrow would bring the battle that would determine the fate of the ancient world. The established order would triumph over the forces of chaos. The gods of Canaan would prove their superiority over the upstart deity of the wilderness wanderers. Cities that survived: Sidon, Tyre, and Gaza. While inland cities fell to Joshua's advancing armies, the coastal settlements watched from behind their walls of stone and water. Sidon, Tyre, and Gaza had witnessed the conquest of their neighbors with growing concern. Yet their unique positions offered advantages that inland cities lacked. Sidon perched on the Mediterranean coast like a jewel set in silver. The city's harbor welcomed ships from across the ancient world, bringing wealth that flowed through its markets like a never-ending stream. Phoenician merchants had built this place into a center of commerce that rivaled the greatest capitals. The city's walls rose directly from the sea, making assault from the water nearly impossible. Land approaches were narrow and easily defended. More importantly, Sidon's ships could carry the population to safety if conquest became inevitable. The sea provided both wealth and escape. Tyre's position was even more remarkable. The city stood on an island connected to the mainland by a narrow causeway. Attackers would need to cross this exposed bridge under fire from the city's archers. The defenders could destroy the causeway if necessary, turning their home into an impregnable island fortress. The city's purple dye industry generated wealth that exceeded that of most kingdoms. Phoenician purple was worth more than gold, coveted by royalty across the ancient world. The secret of its production was guarded more carefully than military plans. This monopoly made Tyre indispensable to the luxury trade. Gaza commanded the southern approaches to Canaan, serving as a gateway between Egypt and the northern territories. The city's strategic position made it a vital link in the trade networks that connected Africa with Asia. Caravans from every direction passed through its gates. The city's relationship with Egypt provided protection that other settlements lacked. Pharaoh's garrison occupied the citadel, ready to defend this crucial outpost. Egyptian chariots patrolled the surrounding territory, maintaining order along the trade routes. The great empire's power cast a protective shadow over Gaza. These coastal cities possessed advantages that inland settlements had lacked. Their economies were based on trade rather than agriculture, making them less dependent on local resources. Their populations included skilled craftsmen and merchants who could adapt to changing circumstances. Their wealth could purchase safety when military strength proved insufficient. The coastal cities also maintained connections with the broader ancient world. Ships carried news of Joshua's conquests to distant lands, but they also brought information about events beyond Canaan's borders. This knowledge helped the cities understand their position in the wider struggle between empires. Sidon's response to the Israelite threat was typically pragmatic. The city's merchants understood that successful trade required stable relationships with all potential customers. They sent diplomatic missions to Joshua's camp, seeking agreements that would preserve their commercial interests. Tyre's isolation bred a different kind of confidence. The city's leaders believed their island fortress was impregnable. They had weathered previous storms by relying on their natural defenses and maritime connections. The current crisis would pass like others before it. Gaza's Egyptian garrison complicated the situation. The city's fate was tied to Pharaoh's broader strategy in the region. If Egypt chose to contest the Israelite conquest, Gaza would become a focal point of resistance. If the empire retreated, the city would need to negotiate its own survival. The coastal city's survival strategies reflected their unique circumstances. They offered tribute rather than resistance, trade partnerships rather than military confrontation. Their wealth became a diplomatic tool, purchasing peace when force might have brought destruction. The partial conquest of Canaan created a complex political situation. The Israelites controlled the interior, but the coast remained in other hands. Trade routes were divided between multiple authorities. The ancient world's commercial networks adapted to new realities while maintaining their essential functions. The surviving cities would continue to influence events in the region for centuries to come. Their merchant fleets would carry Israelite products to distant markets. Their craftsmen would introduce new technologies and techniques. Their diplomatic connections would shape the balance of power in the Eastern Mediterranean. The coastal cities' survival demonstrated that conquest was not always total. Geography, wealth, and diplomatic skill could preserve independence even when military resistance failed. The ancient world was large enough to accommodate multiple centers of power, each adapting to changing circumstances in its own way. The puzzle of the incomplete conquest. The conquest of Canaan ended not with a single decisive victory, but with a gradual recognition that complete control remained elusive. Joshua's armies had achieved remarkable success, capturing major cities and breaking the power of established kingdoms. Yet, pockets of resistance remained, creating a puzzle that would influence the region's future for generations. The reasons for incomplete conquest were as complex as the land itself. Some cities had negotiated agreements that preserved their autonomy in exchange for tribute. Others had retreated to fortress positions that were too costly to assault. Still others had been bypassed during the initial campaigns, leaving them isolated but unconquered. Geography played a crucial role in determining which areas remained outside Israelite control. The coastal plains, with their dense populations and Egyptian connections, proved difficult to hold. The northern mountains provided refuges for groups that chose resistance over accommodation. The southern desert offered escape routes for those who fled rather than fight. The Israelite forces themselves had limitations that became apparent over time. The army was composed primarily of tribal levies rather than professional soldiers. These men had families and farms that required attention. Extended campaigns created hardships that grew more difficult to sustain as time passed. The administrative challenges of governing conquered territories exceeded the military difficulties of capturing them. Each city had its own customs, laws, and traditions. Integrating these diverse populations into a unified system required skills and resources that the Israelites were still developing. Economic factors also influenced the conquest scope. The Israelite economy was based on agriculture and pastoralism rather than trade and manufacturing. The wealth generated by Canaanite cities was important, but managing complex commercial networks required expertise that the conquerors lacked. The religious dimension of the conquest created additional complications. Divine commands called for the complete elimination of Canaanite influence, but practical considerations suggested that accommodation might be preferable to destruction. The tension between religious ideals and political realities shaped many decisions. Some areas remained unconquered because they posed no immediate threat. Isolated communities in mountainous regions could be ignored as long as they remained passive. The coast cities, despite their wealth and strategic importance, were often left alone because they did not interfere with Israelite control of the interior. The incomplete conquest also reflected the broader geopolitical situation. Egypt still maintained some influence in the region, particularly along the coastal areas. Mesopotamian powers watched events from a distance, ready to intervene if opportunities arose. The Israelites needed to balance their expansionist goals against the risk of provoking larger conflicts. The pattern of partial conquest created a unique political landscape. The Israelites controlled the central highlands and many of the major cities, but significant populations remained under different authorities. This patchwork of control would influence the region's development for centuries to come. Trade relationships complicated the military situation. Many unconquered cities maintained commercial connections with Israelite-controlled territories. These economic ties created incentives for peaceful coexistence rather than continued warfare. Mutual benefit often proved more attractive than mutual destruction. The tribal structure of Israelite society also influenced the conquest's limits. Different tribes had different priorities and capabilities. Some were more aggressive in pursuing territorial expansion, while others focused on consolidating their existing holdings. This diversity of approaches led to uneven results across the region. The incomplete conquest ultimately became a defining feature of the region's history. The survival of diverse populations created a complex cultural landscape where different traditions continued to influence each other. The ancient world was rarely simple, and Canaan's conquest reflected this complexity in ways that would resonate through the ages. The survivors: Philistines, Hivites, and Jebusites. The conquest's end revealed a transformed but not emptied land. Among the survivors were peoples whose names would echo through history, each adapting to the new reality in their own way. The Philistines, Hivites, and Jebusites represented different strategies for survival in a world where the old order had crumbled. The Philistines had arrived in Canaan as part of the great upheaval that swept across the ancient world. These sea peoples brought with them technologies and traditions that differed markedly from those of the established Canaanite cities. Their timing proved fortunate, as their arrival coincided with the period of conquest and change. The Philistine cities clustered along the southern coast, where their ships could maintain connections with the broader Mediterranean world. Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Gath, and Ekron formed a pentapolis that controlled the coastal trade routes. Their position between Egypt and the interior gave them leverage that inland cities lacked. Philistine military technology exceeded that of most other peoples in the region. Their smiths worked iron with skill that bordered on artistry. Their weapons were superior to the bronze implements that most armies still used. Their military organization reflected traditions developed through centuries of warfare across the Mediterranean. The Philistines' relationship with the Israelites was complex from the beginning. Geographic proximity created inevitable friction, but economic interests sometimes aligned. The coastal cities needed products from the interior, while the highland settlements required access to Mediterranean trade networks. The Hivites represented a different survival strategy. These people had inhabited the land since ancient times, their roots reaching deep into Canaan's history. When conquest came, they chose accommodation over resistance, preserving their communities through negotiation rather than warfare. The Hivite cities were scattered across the region, each maintaining its own character while acknowledging the new political reality. Gibeon's successful deception had demonstrated the effectiveness of diplomatic solutions. Other Hivite settlements followed this example, finding ways to maintain their identity while accepting Israelite authority. Hivite culture blended elements from many sources. Their religious practices incorporated influences from Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the local Canaanite traditions. Their languages reflected contact with numerous peoples over centuries of coexistence. This cultural flexibility helped them adapt to changing circumstances. The Jebusites occupied perhaps the most strategic position of all the surviving peoples. Their city of Jerusalem commanded the central highlands, controlling routes that connected the northern and southern territories. The city's natural defenses made it a formidable stronghold. Jerusalem's walls followed the contours of the land, creating a fortress that seemed to grow from the rocky hills. The city's water supply came from springs that flowed even during the driest seasons. The population was small but skilled in the arts of defensive warfare. The Jebusite survival strategy focused on neutrality rather than active resistance. They maintained friendly relations with all their neighbors while avoiding entangling alliances. Their city served as a neutral ground where different peoples could meet and trade without fear of conflict. The Jebusite king understood that his city's value lay in its position rather than its military strength. Jerusalem controlled routes that were essential for trade and communication. Any power that sought to dominate the region would eventually need to control this strategic crossroads. The survival of these peoples created a complex political landscape. The Israelites controlled much of the territory, but significant populations remained under different authorities. This patchwork of control required constant negotiation and adjustment. Cultural exchange occurred despite political divisions. Israelite farmers learned new techniques from Philistine craftsmen. Hivite merchants carried goods between different communities. Jebusite scribes maintained records that served multiple populations. The ancient world was rarely static, and these interactions created new possibilities. The surviving peoples also preserved traditions that might otherwise have disappeared. Philistine pottery styles influenced regional development. Hivite religious practices contributed to the evolving spiritual landscape. Jebusite architectural techniques shaped the construction of later buildings. Military tensions persisted alongside peaceful exchanges. The Philistines' spear weapons created security concerns for their neighbors. Border disputes arose when different groups claimed the same territories. The potential for conflict remained constant, even when actual warfare was avoided. The survivors represented more than just political entities. They embodied different approaches to dealing with conquest and change. Their varied strategies demonstrated that adaptation took many forms, each reflecting the unique circumstances and character of the people involved. The presence of these unconquered peoples would influence the region's future development in ways that could not have been predicted. Their survival ensured that the ancient world's complexity would continue. creating new challenges and opportunities for all who lived in the transformed landscape of Canaan. The Jebusite stronghold, Jerusalem before David High on a ridge between two valleys, Jerusalem stood like a crown jewel that refused to dim. The Jebusites had claimed this sacred hill for centuries before Joshua's armies ever crossed the Jordan. Their city perched on Mount Zion, surrounded by steep valleys that formed natural barriers against invasion. The Jebusites traced their roots back to Canaan's earliest days. They were descendants of the third son of Canaan, according to ancient genealogies. Their name meant threshing floor people, connecting them to the cycles of harvest and grain. This connection would prove more meaningful than anyone could imagine. Jerusalem's position made it nearly impossible to conquer. The city sat atop limestone cliffs, with the Kidron Valley cutting deep along its eastern edge. To the west, the Hinnom Valley created another natural moat. Only from the north could armies approach on level ground, and the Jebusites had fortified this weakness with massive walls and towers. The city controlled vital trade routes between Egypt and Mesopotamia. Caravans carrying precious goods had to pass through or around Jerusalem's territory. This brought wealth flowing into Jebusite coffers, allowing them to maintain strong defenses and hire skilled warriors. Water proved to be Jerusalem's secret strength. The Gihon spring bubbled up from deep underground, providing fresh water even during long sieges. The Jebusites carved tunnels through solid rock to bring this water safely inside their walls. These passages remained hidden from enemy eyes, ensuring the city could withstand months of blockade. The Jebusite king during Joshua's time bore the title Adoni-Zedek, meaning Lord of Righteousness. This wasn't just a name, but a declaration of divine authority. The Jebusites believed their city stood at the center of the world, a sacred place where heaven touched earth. Their religion centered on El Elyon, the Most High God. They saw Jerusalem as his earthly dwelling place, making their city holy ground. This belief gave Jebusite warriors extra courage in battle. They fought not just for land or treasure, but for the honor of their deity. When Joshua's armies swept through the southern cities, Jerusalem remained unconquered. The Israelites tried to take the city, but found its defenses too strong. The steep approaches, thick walls, and determined defenders turned every assault into a costly failure. The Jebusites developed a unique relationship with their Israelite neighbors. Sometimes they fought, sometimes they traded. The boundary between Jerusalem and Israelite territory became a place of constant tension and occasional cooperation. Archaeological evidence reveals Jerusalem's prosperity during this period. Pottery shards show trade connections reaching as far as Cyprus and Egypt. Bronze tools and weapons indicate skilled craftsmen worked within the city walls. The Jebusites had built more than just a fortress. They had created a thriving urban center. The city's layout reflected careful planning. Houses clustered around courtyards with narrow streets winding between them. Storage areas held grain and oil for lean times. Workshops produced goods for both local use and distant trade. Jebusite culture blended many influences. Egyptian artistic styles appeared in their pottery and jewelry. Mesopotamian techniques shaped their metalworking. Yet they maintained their own distinct identity, worshiping their own gods and following their own customs. The fortress city became a symbol of Canaanite resistance. While other great cities fell to Israelite armies, Jerusalem stood firm. Its survival gave hope to other unconquered peoples throughout the land. For nearly 4 centuries, the Jebusites would hold their mountain stronghold. They watched empires rise and fall, saw neighboring peoples come and go. Their city remained a constant, a reminder that some places resist conquest through sheer stubbornness and strategic advantage. The Jebusites knew their city's true power lay not in its walls or weapons, but in its position. They controlled the crossroads of ancient trade routes. They held the high ground that dominated the surrounding countryside. Most importantly, they possessed the water source that made long-term settlement possible. This would be the city that one day would become the capital of Israel. But for now, it remained proudly Jebusite, a testament to the enduring strength of Canaan's forgotten peoples. The archaeological debate. Modern shovels bite into ancient earth, seeking truth beneath layers of dust and time. For over a century, archaeologists have dug through the ruins of Canaan, searching for evidence of the great conquest described in biblical texts. What they found has sparked debates that continue to this day. The story begins in the 1920s when British archaeologist John Garstang first excavated Jericho. His team uncovered burned walls and collapsed structures that seemed to match the biblical account perfectly. Garstang announced he had found proof of Joshua's conquest, dating the destruction to around 1400 BCE. But archaeology rarely provides simple answers. Later excavations at Jericho told a different story. Kathleen Kenyon, working in the 1950s, found that the city had been destroyed and abandoned centuries before the traditional date of the Israelite conquest. The walls, Garstang thought, proved the biblical account actually belonged to a much earlier period. This pattern repeated across Canaan. At Ai, archaeologists found ruins from the early Bronze Age, but the site appeared to have been uninhabited during the late Bronze Age when Joshua supposedly conquered it. The name Ai itself means ruin in Hebrew, suggesting the Israelites found only ancient ruins where they expected a living city. Hazor presented a different puzzle. Excavations revealed a massive city that was indeed destroyed by fire around 1200 BCE. This matched the general timeframe of the conquest. But the destruction appeared to be part of a broader pattern of collapse affecting the entire eastern Mediterranean, not the result of a single military campaign. The archaeological evidence painted a complex picture. Some cities showed signs of destruction and burning. Others revealed gradual cultural changes rather than sudden conquest. Still others appeared to have been abandoned peacefully, their inhabitants simply moving elsewhere. Scholars began to propose alternative theories. Some suggested the Israelites emerged gradually from within Canaanite society rather than conquering from outside. Others pointed to climate change, economic collapse, or political upheaval as explanations for the changes archaeologists observed. The debate intensified as new dating methods became available. Carbon-14 testing allowed more precise dating of ancient remains. Pottery analysis revealed trade patterns and cultural connections. DNA studies began to trace population movements across the ancient Near East. These tools revealed a more nuanced picture of ancient Canaan. The region experienced waves of migration, cultural exchange, and gradual transformation. Cities rose and fell for many reasons beyond military conquest. Economic changes, environmental pressures, and political shifts all played roles in shaping the archaeological record. The Amarna letters discovered in Egypt provided another perspective. These diplomatic correspondence from the 14th century BCE mentioned various Canaanite city-states and their struggles with groups called the Habiru. Some scholars connected these Habiru to the Hebrews, suggesting the biblical conquest might preserve memories of smaller-scale conflicts and migrations. Recent excavations have added new complexity to the debate. At Khirbet Qeiyafa, archaeologists uncovered what might be a 10th century Israelite city. At Tel Esafi, they found evidence of Philistine culture persisting long after the supposed conquest. Each new discovery adds pieces to an increasingly complex puzzle. The debate reflects deeper questions about the nature of historical evidence. How should we interpret ancient texts? What can archaeology tell us about the past? How do we reconcile different types of evidence when they seem to contradict each other? Some archaeologists argue for a minimalist approach, accepting only what can be proven through physical evidence. Others advocate for a more synthetic method, combining archaeological, biblical, and historical sources to create a fuller picture of the past. The scientific method demands careful analysis of evidence. Archaeologists must distinguish between what they find and what they hope to find. Personal beliefs and cultural backgrounds can influence interpretation, making objectivity challenging but essential. Modern excavations use increasingly sophisticated techniques. Ground-penetrating radar reveals buried structures before digging begins. Microscopic analysis of soil samples provides clues about ancient activities. Computer modeling helps reconstruct how ancient cities might have looked and functioned. The debate continues because the stakes remain high. For many people, the historical accuracy of biblical accounts carries deep personal and religious significance. For others, understanding the past helps explain how modern cultures developed and spread. Perhaps the most important lesson from this ongoing debate is the value of intellectual honesty. Archaeological evidence must be evaluated on its own merits, regardless of what we might wish it to prove. The search for truth requires patience, precision, and the willingness to change our minds when new evidence emerges. The cities of Canaan still keep many of their secrets. Each excavation season brings new discoveries that might support, challenge, or complicate our understanding of the past. The debate will likely continue as long as archaeologists keep digging and scholars keep thinking about what they find. The Amarna letters. In the ruins of an ancient Egyptian city, archaeologists made a discovery that would change our understanding of Canaan forever. Hidden in the remains of Akhenaten, the capital built by the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten, they found nearly 400 clay tablets covered in cuneiform script. These became known as the Amarna letters, diplomatic correspondence from the 14th century BCE. The tablets paint a vivid picture of Canaan during the Late Bronze Age. City-states throughout the region sent urgent messages to the Egyptian pharaoh, their overlord and protector. The letters reveal a world in crisis, with local rulers crying out for help against various threats and enemies. Reading these ancient dispatches feels like eavesdropping on conversations across the centuries. The tone shifts from formal diplomatic language to desperate pleas for assistance. Local kings address the pharaoh as their lord and master, sometimes prostrating themselves 7 times 7 in written humility. The letters mention many locations familiar from biblical accounts. Jerusalem, Hazor, Lachish, and Gezer all appear in the correspondence. But these cities exist in a different context than the biblical narrative suggests. They are Egyptian vassals, not independent Canaanite strongholds preparing to resist Israelite conquest. One of the most intriguing aspects of the Amarna letters is their frequent mention of groups called the Habiru. These people appear throughout the correspondence as troublemakers, raiders, and rebels who threaten the established order. City-state rulers repeatedly ask for Egyptian military support to deal with Habiru attacks. The Habiru seem to operate differently from traditional armies. They don't conquer cities in massive campaigns, but instead infiltrate regions gradually. They form alliances with local populations, sometimes peacefully absorbing communities that join their cause. Their tactics rely more on politics and persuasion than pure military force. Some scholars have noted similarities between the Habiru and the Hebrews of biblical tradition. Both groups emerge from outside established urban centers. Both challenge the existing political order. Both seem to represent social movements as much as ethnic groups. The connection remains controversial. The Habiru appear in texts across the ancient Near East, from Mesopotamia to Egypt. They seem to represent a broader social category of displaced peoples, mercenaries, and refugees, rather than a specific ethnic group. Yet the timing and location of their activities in Canaan align intriguingly with biblical chronology. The letters also reveal the complex political situation in Canaan during this period. Local rulers constantly scheme against each other while maintaining loyalty to Egypt. They accuse rivals of treachery, form temporary alliances, and switch sides when convenient. The region appears to be a patchwork of competing loyalties and shifting power relationships. Egyptian control over Canaan seems weaker than previously thought. The pharaoh's local representatives struggle to maintain order. Communication between Egypt and Canaan takes weeks or months, making quick responses to crises impossible. Local rulers often must handle problems on their own, despite their formal dependence on Egyptian support. The letters show how environmental factors affected ancient politics. Drought, famine, and disease all influence the political situation. When harvests fail, social tensions increase. Desperate people become more willing to join rebel groups or abandon their traditional allegiances. Trade relationships also emerge from the correspondence. Cities depend on each other for essential goods. When political instability disrupts trade routes, economic hardship follows. The letters reveal how closely political and economic systems were intertwined in the ancient world. The writing style of the Amarna letters reflects the multilingual nature of ancient diplomacy. Local rulers write in Akkadian, the international language of the time, but their native languages often influence their grammar and vocabulary. These linguistic traces help scholars understand the ethnic and cultural diversity of ancient Canaan. Some letters provide glimpses of daily life in Canaanite cities. Rulers mention harvests, building projects, and family relationships. They describe festivals, religious ceremonies, and cultural practices. These details help bring the ancient world to life beyond the realm of politics and warfare. The correspondence also reveals how news and information traveled in the ancient world. Messages move along established routes, carried by professional messengers. Important news spreads from city to city, sometimes changing in the telling. Rumors and gossip mix with official reports, creating a complex information network. The Amarna letters demonstrate how historical events can be understood from multiple perspectives. While later biblical accounts focus on Israelite experiences, these contemporary documents show how the same period looked to Egyptian officials and Canaanite city-state rulers. Neither perspective tells the complete story, but together they create a richer understanding of the past. The tablets remind us that ancient peoples were not so different from ourselves. They worried about security, prosperity, and family. They formed alliances and nursed grudges. They adapted to changing circumstances while trying to maintain their traditional ways of life. These voices from the past continue to speak to anyone willing to listen. The Amarna letters offer a unique window into a world in transition, where old certainties were crumbling and new powers were emerging. They show us that history is always more complex and nuanced than any single account can capture. The forgotten cities beneath the dust, beneath the olive groves and wheat fields of modern Israel and Palestine, entire cities sleep in silence. These are the forgotten settlements of ancient Canaan, places where people once lived, worked, and dreamed. Today, only gentle mounds in the landscape hint at the vibrant communities that once called these places home. Tel Arad rises from the Negev desert like a sleeping giant. This ancient city controlled the southern approaches to the hill country, watching over trade routes that connected Egypt with the northern kingdoms. Archaeological layers reveal thousands of years of continuous habitation, with each generation building upon the ruins of the last. The earliest settlers chose Arad's location carefully. The site sits on a natural hill with good visibility in all directions. Springs nearby provided reliable water sources. The position allowed residents to control access to the mineral-rich Dead Sea region, where salt and bitumen could be harvested for trade. Excavations have uncovered remarkably well-preserved structures at Arad. Stone houses cluster around courtyards, their walls still standing several feet high. Storage jars remain in place, some still containing ancient grains. The city's water system, with its carefully engineered cisterns and channels, demonstrates sophisticated urban planning. Tel Gezer commanded the coastal plain from its strategic hilltop position. The city sat astride the Via Maris, the ancient highway that connected Egypt with Syria and Mesopotamia. Any army or merchant caravan traveling this route had to pass under Gezer's watchful eye. The city's massive gates still inspire awe today. 6-chambered passages flanked by thick walls and towers controlled access to the city. These gates were more than defensive structures. They served as centers of civic life, where legal proceedings took place and merchants conducted business. Gezer's high place reveals the religious practices of its ancient inhabitants. A row of standing stones, each over 10 feet tall, marks a sacred area where ceremonies honoring various deities took place. The stones stand like silent sentinels, their original purpose now lost to time. The city of Bethel, mentioned frequently in biblical accounts, lies buried beneath the modern Palestinian village of Beitin. Limited excavations have revealed evidence of Bronze Age occupation, but much of the ancient city remains unexplored. The site's continuous occupation makes archaeological work challenging as modern buildings cover ancient ruins. What we know of ancient Bethel comes from scattered finds and historical accounts. The city appears to have been a major religious center, with temples and shrines that drew pilgrims from across the region. Its name, meaning House of God, suggests the sacred significance that multiple cultures attach to this location. Tel Azekah guards the entrance to the Elah Valley, where David supposedly fought Goliath. The city's ruins reveal multiple phases of construction and destruction, each telling part of the story of Canaan's turbulent history. Recent excavations have uncovered evidence of a massive siege, with arrowheads and sling stones scattered throughout destruction layers. The city's fortifications demonstrate the advanced military architecture of ancient Canaan. Multiple walls, towers, and gates created a complex defensive system. The outer walls protected the lower city where most residents lived, while the inner citadel provided a final refuge during sieges. Lachish, one of Canaan's most important cities, lies buried at Tel Lachish. The site has yielded some of the most spectacular archaeological finds in the region. Palace complexes, religious shrines, and residential areas paint a picture of a sophisticated urban center that controlled much of the southern Shephelah. The city's destruction layers tell dramatic stories of ancient warfare. Burned buildings, scattered weapons, and hastily buried treasures provide evidence of violent conquests. The discovery of hundreds of skeletons in a mass grave speaks to the harsh realities of ancient conflict. Each forgotten city tells a unique story of human adaptation and resilience. The people who built these settlements faced challenges that would test any society. They dealt with warfare, drought, disease, and political upheaval. Yet they persevered, creating communities that endured for centuries. The artifacts recovered from these sites reveal the daily lives of ordinary people. Cooking pots, grinding stones, and storage jars show how families prepared and preserved food. Tools and weapons demonstrate the crafts and industries that supported urban life. Jewelry and decorative objects reveal artistic traditions and cultural values. Trade goods from distant lands appear in many excavations. Egyptian pottery, Mesopotamian cylinder seals, and Cypriot copper ingots show how these cities participated in international commerce. Even small settlements had connections to the wider world, importing exotic goods and exporting local products. The religious practices of these forgotten cities emerge from temple ruins and cult objects. Altars, incense burners, and figurines provide clues about the gods and goddesses worshipped by ancient Canaanites. These artifacts suggest religious traditions that were both diverse and sophisticated. Many sites show evidence of sudden abandonment. Entire neighborhoods appear to have been evacuated hastily, with valuable objects left behind. Some cities were burned, others simply abandoned. Climate change, political upheaval, and economic collapse all played roles in these urban failures. The forgotten cities remind us that the past is not a simple story of conquest and replacement. Archaeological evidence shows cultural continuity alongside change. New peoples often adopted existing traditions while adding their own contributions. The result was a rich tapestry of cultural interaction and adaptation. Today, these ancient sites face new threats. Modern development, agriculture, and looting all endanger archaeological remains. Many important sites have been damaged or destroyed before they could be properly studied. Each lost site represents irreplaceable information about our shared human past. The forgotten cities of Canaan continue to yield their secrets to patient archaeologists. Each excavation season brings new discoveries that add to our understanding of ancient life. These silent ruins speak to anyone willing to listen, telling stories of human triumph and tragedy that resonate across the centuries. The Canaanite legacy in Israelite culture. The morning sun rises over ancient hills where two peoples became one. Though biblical accounts speak of conquest and replacement, the archaeological record tells a different story. The Canaanites did not simply vanish from history. Instead, their culture, language, and traditions wove themselves into the fabric of Israelite society, creating a complex tapestry of shared heritage. Language provides the clearest evidence of this cultural blending. Hebrew and Canaanite belong to the same linguistic family, sharing common roots and structures. Many Hebrew words derive directly from Canaanite sources. The very word Hebrew itself may connect to the Canaanite term Habiru, meaning outsider or refugee. Hebrew poetry adopted Canaanite literary forms and expressions. The Psalms contain phrases and metaphors that appear in earlier Canaanite religious texts. The Song of Songs uses imagery and language that closely parallels Canaanite love poetry. Even the structure of Hebrew verse follows patterns established in Canaanite literature. Religious practices also show significant Canaanite influence. The Hebrew temple service incorporated rituals and ceremonies that had Canaanite precedents. Sacrificial practices, Festival celebrations and priestly functions all show connections to earlier Canaanite traditions. The temple itself, with its Holy of Holies and sacred furniture, and followed architectural patterns found in Canaanite sanctuaries. The names of places throughout Israel preserve Canaanite origins. Jerusalem, Hebron, Jericho, and countless other locations bear names that predate the Israelite arrival. These names often contain references to Canaanite deities or natural features. The persistence of these names suggests continuous occupation and cultural transmission. Agricultural practices passed directly from Canaanite to Israelite hands. The terraced hillsides, irrigation systems, and crop selection methods that sustained Israelite communities had been developed by Canaanite farmers over centuries. The biblical calendar of festivals corresponds to the agricultural year established by Canaanite predecessors. Craft traditions also show remarkable continuity. Pottery styles, metalworking techniques, and textile production methods continued with little change from Canaanite to Israelite periods. Archaeological excavations often struggle to distinguish between Canaanite and early Israelite artifacts, suggesting gradual cultural transition rather than sudden replacement. Urban planning and architecture reveal similar patterns of continuity. Israelite cities often followed layout patterns established by their Canaanite predecessors. House designs, street arrangements, and public buildings all show connections to earlier Canaanite traditions. The knowledge of how to build and maintain cities passed from one generation to the next. Legal traditions also show Canaanite influence. Many laws found in biblical texts have parallels in earlier Mesopotamian and Canaanite legal codes. Concepts of justice, property rights, and social responsibility evolved from precedents established in Canaanite society. The biblical legal system built upon foundations laid by previous civilizations. Musical traditions reveal another area of cultural blending. The instruments mentioned in biblical texts appear in earlier Canaanite contexts. Lyres, harps, and percussion instruments all have Canaanite antecedents. The structure of Hebrew music, with its modal scales and rhythmic patterns, shows connections to broader Canaanite musical traditions. Trade networks established by Canaanite merchants continue to operate under Israelite control. The routes, partnerships, and commercial practices that connected Canaan to the broader Mediterranean world provided the foundation for Israelite economic development. Knowledge of foreign languages, currencies, and business customs passed from Canaanite to Israelite merchants. Religious concepts also show complex patterns of adoption and adaptation. The Hebrew conception of divine kingship has parallels in Canaanite royal ideology. The idea of a covenant between deity and people appears in earlier Canaanite texts. Even the imagery used to describe God borrows from Canaanite religious vocabulary. The process of cultural transmission often involved reinterpretation rather than simple adoption. Israelite scribes and priests took Canaanite concepts and transformed them to fit their own theological framework. Canaanite myths became Hebrew historical accounts. Canaanite religious practices were modified to serve Hebrew religious purposes. Archaeological evidence suggests that cultural change occurred gradually over several centuries. Rather than sudden conquest and replacement, the evidence points to a slow process of cultural blending and transformation. Canaanite and Israelite communities lived side by side, intermarrying and sharing cultural practices. The biblical accounts themselves preserve evidence of this cultural blending. Stories of intermarriage, religious syncretism, and cultural conflict all point to a complex process of cultural interaction. The warnings against adopting Canaanite practices suggest that such adoption was common enough to concern religious leaders. Modern scholarship has moved away from simple conquest models toward more nuanced understandings of cultural change. The emergence of Israelite identity appears to have involved the transformation of existing Canaanite communities rather than their replacement by outside conquerors. This process created a new cultural synthesis that drew from both traditions. The Canaanite legacy in Israelite culture demonstrates the complex nature of cultural transmission. Conquering peoples often adopt more from their subjects than they impose upon them. The practical knowledge needed to survive in a new environment comes from those who have lived there longest. This cultural blending created the foundation for later Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions. The Hebrew Bible, which preserves both Israelite innovations and Canaanite inheritances, became the foundation text for half of humanity. The Canaanite contribution to this tradition, though often overlooked, remains substantial and enduring. The story of Canaanite influence on Israelite culture reminds us that cultural boundaries are often more fluid than political ones. People adapt, adopt, and transform the traditions they encounter. The result is usually richer and more complex than any single cultural tradition could produce on its own. The rise of the judges. The sun sets on Joshua's generation, and darkness falls across the land of Canaan. The great commander who led the conquest has died, taking with him the unity and purpose that bound the tribes together. In the vacuum left by his passing, a new era begins, one marked by chaos, conflict, and the rise of unlikely heroes, known as judges. The book of Judges paints a grim picture of post-conquest Canaan. The phrase, "In those days there was no king in Israel, everyone did what was right in his own eyes," captures the anarchic spirit of the age. Without central authority, the 12 tribes fragment into competing interests, each pursuing its own agenda. The incomplete nature of the conquest becomes painfully apparent. Cities that Joshua bypassed or failed to capture reassert their independence. Canaanite enclaves that survived the initial assault begin to push back against Israelite settlements. The Philistines, fresh from their own conquests along the coast, eye the hill country with growing ambition. Religious syncretism poses an even greater threat than military enemies. The stark monotheism that Moses taught in the wilderness meets the rich polytheism of Canaan. Israelite farmers, desperate to ensure good harvests, begin offering sacrifices to Baal and Asherah alongside their traditional offerings to Yahweh. The line between acceptable adaptation and forbidden apostasy blurs. The judge system emerges as a response to this crisis. These leaders differ fundamentally from the monarchy that would follow. Judges arise spontaneously during times of crisis, usually in response to foreign oppression or internal strife. Their authority comes from charismatic leadership rather than hereditary succession. The first judges appear in the south, where Israelite control seems strongest. But even here, problems multiply. The tribe of Judah struggles to complete its conquest of the hill country. The Jebusites remain firmly entrenched in Jerusalem. Philistine pressure from the coastal plain grows stronger each year. Ehud of Benjamin becomes the first judge to gain widespread recognition. His assassination of the Moabite king Eglon demonstrates the unconventional tactics that characterize this period. Judges succeed through cunning, courage, and divine inspiration rather than overwhelming military force. The story of Deborah reveals how desperate the situation has become. When military leaders fail to act, a prophetess must rally the tribes to face the Canaanite threat. Her partnership with Barak shows how traditional gender roles bend under the pressure of crisis. The victory over Sisera's chariot army near Mount Tabor provides temporary relief, but fails to solve underlying problems. Gideon's rise illustrates the complex relationship between faith and politics during this period. His destruction of his father's Baal altar creates family tension that mirrors the broader cultural conflict. His military success against the Midianites establishes his reputation, but his creation of a golden ephod shows how easily religious practice can slide into idolatry. The judge system reveals its fundamental weakness in the story of Gideon's son, Abimelech. This ambitious young man attempts to establish a hereditary monarchy in Shechem, showing how naturally charismatic leadership evolves toward permanent rule. His brutal reign and violent death demonstrate the dangers of unchecked ambition. Jephthah's judgeship highlights the social tensions of the period. Born of a prostitute and rejected by his family, he leads a band of outlaws before being recalled to defend Gilead against the Ammonites. His rash vow that costs his daughter's life shows how religious fervor can lead to tragic consequences. The Samson stories capture the heroic and tragic dimensions of the judge period. This Nazirite warrior possesses supernatural strength but struggles with personal weakness. His exploits against the Philistines read like ancient superhero tales, but his ultimate failure shows the limits of individual heroism. Between the major judges, the text mentions several minor figures who provide stability in their regions. These local leaders may represent a more common pattern of leadership during this period. Their brief mentions suggest that effective governance continued in some areas despite the broader chaos. The religious situation during the Judges period becomes increasingly complex. The sanctuary at Shiloh attempts to maintain the traditions established by Moses and Joshua, but competing religious sites emerge throughout the land, each claiming legitimacy. The story of Micah's idol and the Levite priest shows how religious practice adapts to local conditions. The final stories in Judges reveal the complete breakdown of social order. The crime at Gibeah, reminiscent of Sodom and Gomorrah, triggers a civil war that nearly destroys the tribe of Benjamin. The solution to Benjamin's marriage problem involves the massacre of Jabesh Gilead and the kidnapping of girls from Shiloh, showing how far moral standards have fallen. The Judge period serves as a transition between the tribal confederation of the wilderness and the monarchy that would follow. Each crisis reveals the inadequacy of the existing system while demonstrating the need for more effective leadership. The repeated cycle of apostasy, oppression, repentance, and deliverance shows both the resilience and the instability of Israelite society. The economic situation during this period remains difficult to assess. Archaeological evidence suggests that many settlements struggled to maintain the prosperity they had achieved during the conquest. Trade networks disrupted by warfare take time to reestablish. The shift from a nomadic to an agricultural economy creates new challenges and opportunities. The Judge period also sees the development of distinctly Israelite cultural traditions. The stories preserved in the Book of Judges reflect oral traditions that took shape during this time. The heroic tales of individual judges provide models of courage and faith that would inspire later generations. The gradual consolidation of tribal identity occurs during this period. Despite political fragmentation, the tribes maintain their sense of common heritage. The amphictyonic system, centered on shared religious obligations, provides a framework for cooperation even when political unity proves impossible. The Judge period ends with the recognition that new forms of leadership are needed. The people's request for a king reflects their desire for stability and security. The transition from judges to monarchy represents a fundamental shift in Israelite political organization, but it builds on foundations laid during the turbulent centuries of the Judges. The Philistine threat. From across the wine-dark sea, new conquerors arrive on Canaan's shores. The Philistines bring with them weapons of iron, chariots of war, and a civilization that will challenge everything the Israelites have built. Their pentapolis of mighty cities, Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath, forms a confederation that threatens to push the hill country peoples back into the desert. The Philistines belong to the great migration of sea peoples that swept across the eastern Mediterranean in the 12th century BCE. Egyptian records describe their battles with these mysterious invaders, who arrived by sea and land in vast numbers. Some groups the Egyptians defeated, others they hired as mercenaries, and still others they allowed to settle in strategic locations. The Philistines received permission to settle along Canaan's southern coast, where they established a sophisticated urban civilization. Their pottery, distinctive with its red and black geometric patterns, shows influences from the Aegean world. Their architecture, weapons, and artistic styles all point to origins in the Greek islands or Western Anatolia. Unlike the Israelites, who struggled to adapt from nomadic to urban life, the Philistines brought advanced urban planning skills to Canaan. Their cities featured impressive fortifications, sophisticated drainage systems, and carefully planned residential districts. Archaeological excavations reveal a level of urban organization that surpassed most contemporary settlements. The Philistine military advantage came from their mastery of iron technology. While most peoples in Canaan still relied on bronze weapons, the Philistines forged iron swords, spears, and armor. This technological superiority gave them a decisive edge in warfare. The biblical account notes that no blacksmith could be found in all of Israel, forcing the Israelites to depend on Philistine craftsmen even for basic tools. The 5 Philistine cities functioned as independent city-states, each ruled by a Saran or lord. These rulers formed a council that made decisions affecting the entire confederation. This system allowed for both local autonomy and collective action, making the Philistines formidable opponents for the loosely organized Israelite tribes. Gaza, the southernmost Philistine city, controlled the vital trade routes connecting Egypt with the rest of the ancient Near East. Its position made it wealthy and strategically important. The city's massive walls and gates reflected both its prosperity and its military significance. Merchants and diplomats from across the known world passed through Gaza's markets. Ashkelon, built on a natural harbor, served as the Philistines' primary port city. Ships from across the Mediterranean brought goods to its docks. The city's wealth came from maritime trade, and its influence extended far beyond Canaan's borders. Ashkelon's temples housed treasures from many lands, reflecting the cosmopolitan nature of Philistine civilization. Ashdod dominated the central coastal plain, serving as a buffer between the Philistine heartland and the Israelite hill country. The city's location made it a natural staging ground for military campaigns against the interior. Its massive temple to Dagon, the Philistine grain god, attracted pilgrims from throughout the Confederation. Ekron, the northernmost Philistine city, stood on the frontier between Philistine and Israelite territories. Recent excavations have revealed it to be one of the largest cities in the ancient Near East during the 7th century BCE. Its olive oil production facilities were among the most advanced in the ancient world, capable of producing thousands of tons of oil annually. Gath, the largest of the Philistine cities, dominated the Shephelah region between the coastal plain and the hill country. This city produced the giant Goliath, who challenged the Israelite army. Archaeological evidence suggests that Gath was indeed inhabited by unusually tall people, lending credence to the biblical accounts of Philistine giants. The Philistine religion centered on a pantheon of gods borrowed from various sources. Dagon, the grain god, seems to have been their primary deity. Baal-zebub, the fly god, was worshipped at Ekron. Ashtoreth, the fertility goddess, had temples throughout the Confederation. These deities reflected the Philistines' agricultural and maritime concerns. The Philistine military organization proved far superior to anything the Israelites could field. Professional soldiers, equipped with standardized weapons and armor, formed the core of their armies. Chariots provided mobility and shock value on the battlefield. Their understanding of siege warfare allowed them to capture fortified cities that had resisted other conquerors. The first major conflict between Philistines and Israelites occurred during the judgeship of Samson. This Nazirite warrior's exploits against the Philistines became legendary, but his individual heroics could not address the larger threat. The Philistines adapted to his tactics, eventually capturing and blinding him. His final act of vengeance brought down the temple of Dagon, but did not end Philistine power. The Philistine threat reached its peak during the late Judge period. Their expansion into the hill country cut off Israelite tribes from each other and from the central sanctuary at Shiloh. The capture of the Ark of the Covenant represented the lowest point of Israelite fortunes. Only divine intervention, causing plagues in Philistine cities, forced them to return the sacred object. The Battle of Aphek demonstrated Philistine military superiority. Their disciplined phalanxes overwhelmed the disorganized Israelite militia. The death of Eli's sons and the capture of the ark sent shockwaves throughout Israel. The Philistines seemed poised to complete their conquest of the hill country. Samuel's emergence as a judge coincided with a shift in Philistine strategy. Rather than attempting outright conquest, they established garrisons in key locations throughout Israelite territory. This system of control allowed them to dominate the region while avoiding the costs of direct administration. Israelite communities found themselves paying tribute to Philistine overlords. The Philistine cultural impact on Canaan extended far beyond military conquest. Their advanced pottery techniques influenced local craftsmen. Their architectural styles appeared in Israelite buildings. Their artistic motifs spread throughout the region. The Philistines represented urban sophistication that contrasted sharply with the rural simplicity of hill country life. Trade relationships between Philistines and Israelites remained complex throughout their long conflict. Despite political tensions, economic necessities forced cooperation. Israelite farmers needed Philistine iron tools and weapons. Philistine cities required hill country products like olive oil and grain. This economic interdependence created opportunities for both conflict and cooperation. The Philistine language remains largely unknown, though scholars have identified a few words in biblical texts. Their writing system, if they had one, has not survived. Most of our knowledge about Philistine culture comes from archaeological evidence and references in other people's literature. This makes them seem mysterious and exotic to modern readers. The Philistine Confederation's political structure proved remarkably stable. Unlike other ancient peoples who frequently changed ruling dynasties, the Philistine city-states maintained consistent leadership over centuries. This stability allowed them to develop long-term strategies and maintain their military advantages. The threat posed by the Philistines ultimately forced the Israelites to develop new forms of political organization. The tribal confederation that had emerged from the wilderness could not effectively resist a unified enemy with superior military technology. The demand for a king arose primarily from the need to coordinate resistance against Philistine expansion. The Philistine legacy in Canaan extended far beyond their military campaigns. Their technological innovations, artistic traditions, and urban planning techniques influenced the development of the entire region. Even after their political power waned, their cultural contributions continued to shape life in ancient Palestine. The name Palestine itself derives from Philistia, the Greek name for the Philistine homeland. This linguistic legacy demonstrates the lasting impact of these sea peoples on the land they adopted. Their influence on language, culture, and technology persisted long after their political independence ended. The final fall of the Canaanites. The morning mist rises from the valley of Elah as a young shepherd boy steps forward to face a giant. This moment, more than any other, symbolizes the turning point in the long struggle between Israel and the remaining Canaanite peoples. David's victory over Goliath represents not just a personal triumph, but the beginning of the end for Canaanite independence in the Promised Land. Saul's kingship marked the beginning of centralized resistance to Philistine expansion. His early victories at Jabesh Gilead and Michmash showed that united Israelite forces could challenge their enemies' technological superiority. But Saul's reign also revealed the limitations of Israel's first attempt at monarchy. His erratic behavior and conflicts with Samuel created instability that the Philistines exploited. The disaster at Mount Gilboa seemed to confirm Philistine superiority. Saul's death, along with 3 of his sons, left Israel leaderless and divided. The Philistines pressed their advantage, establishing garrisons throughout the hill country. For a brief moment, it appeared that they might complete their conquest of the region. David's rise from shepherd to king represents one of history's most remarkable political transformations. His early years as an outlaw leader allowed him to develop the military skills and political alliances that would prove crucial in his later campaigns. His ability to unite the scattered tribes under his leadership provided the foundation for Israel's ultimate victory. The capture of Jerusalem marked David's first major strategic success. The Jebusite stronghold had resisted conquest for centuries, but David's forces found a way through the city's water systems. The fall of Jerusalem eliminated a Canaanite enclave that had divided the northern and southern tribes. More importantly, it provided David with a capital that belonged to no single tribe. David's expansion of Jerusalem transformed it from a modest hilltop fortress into a true capital city. The construction of a royal palace, administrative buildings, and military installations created a power center that could coordinate resistance against remaining Canaanite forces. The decision to bring the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem gave the city religious as well as political significance. The Philistine response to David's growing power came in the form of direct attacks on Jerusalem. The battles in the Valley of Rephaim demonstrated the new military capabilities that David had developed. His forces no longer relied solely on guerrilla tactics, but could meet enemy armies in open battle. The Philistine defeats in these encounters marked the beginning of their decline. The conquest of Gath eliminated the largest Philistine city and broke the back of their confederation. Archaeological evidence suggests that Gath was destroyed around this time, never to recover its former prominence. The fall of this giant city sent shockwaves throughout the region, demonstrating that even the mightiest Canaanite strongholds could not resist Israel's growing power. David's campaign systematically eliminated the remaining pockets of Canaanite resistance. The Moabites, who had controlled much of the Transjordan region, fell to his armies. The Edomites, descendants of Esau, found themselves incorporated into David's expanding kingdom. The Ammonites, who had terrorized the eastern tribes, were decisively defeated and made vassals. The northern campaigns proved even more significant. The Aramean kingdoms of Damascus and Zobah had filled the power vacuum left by the decline of the Hittite Empire. David's victories against these emerging powers established Israel as the dominant force in the Levant. The tribute and trade relationships that resulted from these conquests brought unprecedented wealth to Jerusalem. Solomon's reign represented the culmination of Israel's expansion and the final absorption of Canaanite elements. His building projects, including the temple and palace complex in Jerusalem, demonstrated Israel's transformation from a collection of tribes into a major regional power. The administrative system he developed integrated former Canaanite territories fully into the Israelite kingdom. The construction of the temple marked a turning point in the relationship between Israelite and Canaanite religious traditions. While the temple followed architectural patterns established by Canaanite builders, it served exclusively Israelite religious purposes. The centralization of worship in Jerusalem reduced the influence of local shrines where Canaanite practices had persisted. Solomon's marriage alliances with foreign princesses, including the daughter of Pharaoh, demonstrated Israel's new international status. These diplomatic relationships transformed Israel from a regional challenger into a recognized member of the ancient Near Eastern state system. The Canaanite city-states that had once dominated the region found themselves reduced to junior partners or absorbed entirely. The administrative divisions that Solomon established reflected the new reality of Israelite control. The 12 districts that supplied the royal court incorporated territories that had been Canaanite strongholds for centuries. Cities like Megiddo, Hazor, and Gezer became administrative centers serving Israelite rather than Canaanite purposes. The transformation was not merely political, but cultural as well. Archaeological evidence from this period shows the gradual disappearance of distinctly Canaanite material culture. Pottery styles, architectural forms, and burial customs all show increasing uniformity across the region. The diverse city-state cultures that had characterized Canaan for centuries were giving way to a more homogeneous Israelite civilization. The economic integration of former Canaanite territories brought new prosperity to Israel. The trade networks that Canaanite merchants had established over centuries now served Israelite interests. The agricultural techniques that Canaanite farmers had developed were adopted and improved upon. The craft traditions that had flourished in Canaanite cities continued under Israelite patronage. The process of cultural assimilation was gradual rather than sudden. Many Canaanite families and clans were incorporated into Israelite society through marriage and adoption. The skills and knowledge that Canaanites possessed remained valuable in the new order. Rather than complete replacement, the period saw a complex process of cultural synthesis. The religious transformation proved more complex than the political conquest. While official policy promoted exclusive worship of Yahweh, popular religion continued to incorporate elements from Canaanite traditions. The prophet's constant warnings against idolatry suggest that the attraction of Canaanite religious practices persisted long after political independence ended. The linguistic evidence supports this picture of gradual cultural transformation. Hebrew continued to absorb Canaanite words and expressions throughout this period. The literature produced during Solomon's reign shows sophisticated development of earlier Canaanite literary forms. The wisdom literature in particular demonstrates the continuation of scribal traditions that had roots in Canaanite culture. The final chapters of Canaanite independence were written not in the hill country but along the coast. The Philistine cities continued to maintain nominal independence throughout David's reign, though they were clearly subordinate to Israel. It was only during Solomon's time that these last bastions of Canaanite autonomy were fully integrated into the Israelite kingdom. The transformation of Canaan From a land of independent city-states to a unified kingdom under Israelite rule represents one of the most significant political developments in ancient Near Eastern history. The process took centuries to complete and involved far more cultural exchange than the biblical accounts suggest. The result was a new civilization that preserved much of Canaanite heritage while serving distinctly Israelite purposes. The cities that fought Israel, memory and myth. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the world holds its breath between darkness and light, the ancient cities of Canaan whisper their stories to those who still remember. These are not the grand tales of conquest and glory, but the smaller, more human stories of places that once pulsed with life, of people who loved and feared and hoped, just as we do today. The biblical narrative transforms these forgotten cities into something larger than life. They become symbols rather than places, representing the spiritual battles that shaped Israel's identity. Jericho stands not merely as a Bronze Age settlement, but as proof of divine power over human fortifications. Ai becomes a lesson about the dangers of overconfidence. Hazor represents the fall of earthly pride before heavenly judgment. This transformation from history to memory began even before the conquest was complete. The storytellers who preserved these accounts were not historians in the modern sense, but theologians and teachers. They shaped the raw materials of experience into narratives that would instruct and inspire future generations. The cities of Canaan became characters in a larger story about faith, obedience, and divine promise. The process of mythologization served important social functions. The stories of conquered cities reinforced Israelite identity by defining what they were not. The Canaanites represented everything that faithful Israelites should avoid: idolatry, moral corruption, and rebellion against divine authority. The destruction of their cities provided object lessons about the consequences of unfaithfulness. Yet the biblical texts themselves preserve evidence of a more complex reality. The repeated warnings against adopting Canaanite practices suggest that such adoption was common. The stories of intermarriage and cultural blending reveal the permeable boundaries between conqueror and conquered. The persistence of Canaanite place names and cultural elements points to continuity rather than complete replacement. The archaeological record complicates the neat narrative of conquest and destruction. Many cities show evidence of gradual cultural change rather than sudden violent destruction. Some settlements appear to have been abandoned peacefully, their inhabitants moving elsewhere. Others show signs of repeated destruction and rebuilding, suggesting a more complex pattern of conflict and reconciliation. The transformation of memory accelerated during the period of the monarchy. Court historians and religious leaders shaped the conquest stories to serve contemporary political needs. The tales of Joshua's victories provided legitimacy for royal claims to territorial control. The emphasis on divine mandate supported the centralization of religious and political authority. The exile period brought another layer of meaning to these ancient stories. The destruction of Jerusalem and the loss of the Promised Land created a crisis of faith that demanded explanation. The conquest narratives were reinterpreted to emphasize the importance of faithfulness to divine commands. The fate of the Canaanite cities became a warning about what could happen to Israel itself. The post-exilic community found different meanings in these ancient tales. The stories of conquest and settlement resonated with their own experiences of return and reconstruction. The emphasis on maintaining cultural and religious purity reflected their struggles to preserve identity in a changed world. The Canaanite cities became symbols of the foreign influences that threatened to dilute Jewish distinctiveness. The process of canonization fixed these stories in their final form, but interpretation continued to evolve. Jewish commentators found new layers of meaning in familiar texts. The cities of Canaan became allegories for spiritual states, their conquest representing the believer's victory over sin and temptation. The literal historical events were transformed into timeless spiritual truths. Christian interpretation added yet another dimension to these ancient stories. The conquest of Canaan became a prefiguration of the believer's journey to the heavenly promised land. The battles against Canaanite cities represented the Christians' struggle against worldly temptations. The triumph of Israel foreshadowed the ultimate victory of good over evil. Islamic tradition preserved many of these stories while adding its own interpretive framework. The prophets who led Israel's conquest were recognized as messengers of Allah, and their victories demonstrated divine support for righteous causes. The fate of the Canaanite cities served as warnings about the consequences of rejecting divine guidance. Modern scholarship has attempted to separate the historical core from the mythological overlay, but the process remains contentious. Archaeological evidence provides some support for the biblical accounts while contradicting others. The exact relationship between the literary narratives and historical events may never be fully resolved. The enduring power of these stories lies not in their historical accuracy, but in their ability to speak to universal human experiences. The themes of displacement and settlement, conflict and reconciliation, faith and doubt resonate across cultures and centuries. The cities of Canaan have become part of humanity's shared vocabulary for discussing these fundamental concerns. The process of memory creation continues in the modern world. Archaeological discoveries generate new interest in these ancient sites, while political conflicts invest them with contemporary significance. The cities that fought Israel have become symbols in modern struggles over land, identity, and religious truth. Tourism and popular culture have created new forms of mythologization. Ancient sites are packaged for mass consumption, their complex histories reduced to simple narratives that can be absorbed in brief visits. The cities of Canaan become destinations on spiritual journeys, their original inhabitants forgotten in favor of the stories that have grown around them. The digital age has democratized the process of memory creation. Anyone with internet access can participate in discussions about these ancient cities, contributing their own interpretations and insights. The traditional authorities who once controlled biblical interpretation now compete with countless other voices in the global conversation about these texts. Yet for all the scholarly debate and cultural commentary, the cities of Canaan retain their essential mystery. They exist in that liminal space between history and legend, between memory and imagination. They remind us that all human stories are ultimately about the search for meaning in a world that often seems chaotic and unpredictable. The cities that fought Israel continue to teach us about the power of narrative to shape identity and understanding. They show us how historical events become cultural memories, how local experiences become universal truths. In their transformation from ancient settlements to eternal symbols, they reveal something fundamental about the human need to find meaning in the past and hope for the future. Dust and echoes. The evening wind stirs the dust of ancient Canaan, carrying with it the whispers of forgotten voices. Across the hills where cities once stood proud and strong, only silence remains. The great walls that defied armies have crumbled to stones. The streets that bustled with merchants and children now lie buried beneath wildflowers and grain. Time, the ultimate conqueror, has claimed its victory over all who once walked these paths. In the gathering dusk, we can almost hear the echoes of those vanished lives, the laughter of children playing in narrow alleys, the calls of merchants' huts hawking their wares in busy marketplaces, the songs of priests in temples long since fallen, the prayers of mothers watching their sons march off to war. All these sounds have faded into the vast silence that envelops the ruins of the past. The cities of Canaan fought bravely for their existence. They marshaled their armies, strengthened their walls, and appealed to their gods for protection. Kings and commoners alike believed their civilization would endure forever. They built with stone and bronze, thinking these materials would preserve their memory through the ages. Yet, stone crumbles, bronze corrodes, and memory itself proves fragile. The story we have traced through these ancient lands teaches us about the temporary nature of all human achievement. The mightiest fortress falls eventually. The richest city eventually empties. The proudest empire eventually dissolves. This is not cause for despair, but for reflection on what truly endures beyond the reach of time and conquest. What remains of these forgotten cities is not their walls or weapons, but their contribution to the human story. The Canaanites gave us the alphabet that carries these very words. Their agricultural innovations still feed the world. Their artistic traditions influenced cultures across the Mediterranean. Their legal concepts helped shape the foundations of justice. Their spiritual searching contributed to humanity's ongoing quest for meaning. The cities that fought Israel also gave us something less tangible but equally precious: the recognition that every people, every culture, every individual has a story worth telling. The biblical narrative, for all its focus on Israelite triumph, preserves traces of these other voices. In the names of places, in the descriptions of customs, in the acknowledgement of other people's humanity, we hear echoes of the Canaanite experience. The archaeological record continues to reveal new chapters in this ancient story. Each potsherd recovered, each foundation uncovered, each inscription deciphered adds to our understanding of these vanished peoples. The patient work of scholars gradually rebuilds the world of ancient Canaan brick by brick, word by word, memory by memory. Yet even as we learn more about these ancient peoples, we must acknowledge the limits of our knowledge. So much has been lost forever. Languages that carried the thoughts and dreams of entire peoples have vanished without trace. Religious traditions that sustained communities for centuries have been forgotten. Stories that entertained and instructed countless generations have dissolved into silence. The dust of Canaan mingles the remains of conqueror and conquered, victor and vanquished. The soil that nourishes today's crops contains the dreams of Bronze Age farmers and the ambitions of Iron Age kings. The stones that form modern walls once protected ancient families. The very air we breathe carries molecules that once filled the lungs of Canaanite children. This physical continuity reminds us that the past is not truly past. It lives on in the landscape, in the genes of modern populations, in the cultural traditions that persist despite political upheavals. The cities of Canaan may have fallen, but their influence continues to shape the world we inhabit. The transformation of these ancient places from historical reality to cultural memory reflects a universal human process. Every generation reinterprets the past to serve present needs. The stories change with each telling, accumulating new meanings while losing others. The cities of Canaan became symbols in a grand narrative about divine purpose and human destiny. This process of mythologization serves important functions. It helps communities understand their identity and purpose. It provides moral instruction through the medium of story. It connects present struggles to ancient triumphs and tragedies. Yet, it also risks obscuring the humanity of those who lived these experiences firsthand. The challenge for modern readers is to hold both truths simultaneously: the power of the mythological narrative and the reality of the historical experience. The cities of Canaan matter both as symbols in a spiritual drama and as homes where real people lived, loved, and died. Their conquest represents both divine judgment and human tragedy, both the fulfillment of promise and the destruction of dreams. The silence that now envelops these ancient sites is not empty, but full. It contains multitudes of untold stories, unexpressed hopes, unfinished conversations. The wind that stirs the dust carries forward the breath of all who once lived here. The earth that covers their remains also preserves their memory, waiting for patient archaeologists to uncover their secrets. In the end, the cities of Canaan teach us about the continuity of human experience across time and culture. People in every age face the same fundamental challenges: how to build communities that endure, how to raise children who will thrive, how to find meaning in a world that often seems chaotic and unpredictable. The solutions change, but the questions remain constant. The dust settles now as darkness falls across the land. The stars that once guided Canaanite navigators and Israelite shepherds continue their eternal dance across the heavens. Time flows onward, carrying all things toward the same inevitable destination. But for those who know how to listen, the echoes of ancient voices still whisper in the wind, telling stories of courage and cowardice, love and loss, hope and despair. The cities that fought Israel have become part of humanity's shared memory. Their stories remind us that every ending is also a beginning, every defeat also a transformation. In their dust and echoes, we find not only the record of what was, but also the seeds of what might yet be. The ancient stones lie silent, but their message endures. We are all part of one human story, written in the dust of time, echoing through the ages.